A woman accused of murder arrives at a Kansas ranch under a false name, carrying books instead of alibis. The man who hired her doesn't know the federal marshals are already looking. Before you find out if love can survive a wanted poster, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach left Annie Dalton standing in a cloud of dust that tasted like failure and cowardice combined. She gripped her worn suitcase with one hand and her satchel of books with the other, staring at the structure that would either save her life or become her final mistake. Ridge Ranch, sprawling and half-broken against the Kansas prairie like something that had given up years ago but refused to die. The main house needed paint. The barn door hung crooked. Weeds choked what might have once been a garden. Everything looked like it was holding its breath, waiting for someone to either finish killing it or bring it back. Annie's hands shook. They'd been shaking since Ohio, since the fire, since the night she'd run with nothing but what she could carry, and a name that wasn't hers anymore. "You the woman from the advertisement?" The voice came from the porch. Annie looked up to see a man in his early 30s, tall and lean, in the way of someone who forgot to eat unless forced. His shirt was clean but wrinkled. His hair needed cutting. His face carried the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. Clayton Ridge. Her new employer. The man whose letter had saved her from sleeping behind a railway station in Topeka, waiting for the marshals to find her. "Yes, sir," Annie said, keeping her voice steady through practice. "Annie Dalton. I'm here about the housekeeping position." Clayton came down the steps, moving like a man who'd been alone too long and forgotten how to hurry for company. He took her suitcase without asking, which startled her. Back east, men had stopped offering her courtesy the night the schoolhouse burned. "Place is a mess," Clayton said, not quite looking at her. "Fair warning. My father passed 6 months back. Housekeeper left 2 months after that. I've been managing poorly since." "I'm not afraid of work," Annie said. "Good." Clayton finally met her eyes. His were brown, tired, and surprisingly kind. "Because there's enough work here to kill a person if they're not careful." He didn't know how close to the truth he was. Annie had already died once, in a way. This was just her body, walking around pretending to still be alive. Inside, the house confirmed everything the outside had promised. Dust-covered surfaces that probably hadn't seen a cloth in months. Dishes sat in the sink growing things that shouldn't exist outside a science experiment. The floor needed sweeping. The windows needed washing. The whole place needed someone who gave a damn. Annie had spent the last 3 months not giving a damn about anything except staying ahead of the people who wanted her dead or locked away. Looking at this wreck of a home, she felt something stir that she'd thought the fire had burned out of her completely. "Kitchen's through there," Clayton said, setting down her suitcase. "Your room's upstairs, second door on the left. I cleared it out best I could. Sheets are clean, at least." He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'll be honest, Miss Dalton. I'm desperate enough that I hired you based on your letter alone. Didn't even check your references." Annie's stomach dropped. "Oh? Couldn't?" Clayton said. "Town where you said you worked? Letter came back undeliverable. Whole place must have folded or moved on." He looked embarrassed. "I should probably care more about that, but I've got 30 head of cattle, 4 ranch hands who can't cook to save their lives, and a house falling apart around my ears. So if you're running from something, I figure that's between you and whatever you're running from. Long as you can cook and clean, I don't need to know your whole history." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to Annie since the fire. It was also terrifying. If he'd been the type to check carefully, to write letters and wait for replies, she would have known to run before unpacking. This casual acceptance meant she was trapped by her own desperate need for shelter. "I can cook," Annie said quietly, "and clean. And I'll work hard, Mr. Ridge. You won't regret hiring me." "Clayton," he said. "Mr. Ridge was my father. Just call me Clayton." The first week, Annie worked like someone trying to outrun her own shadow. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached. She beat rugs until dust clouds hung over the prairie like fog. She organized the kitchen, throwing out things that had evolved past the point of being food and starting fresh with supplies from town. The ranch hands, 4 men ranging from barely 20 to pushing 60, watched her with the suspicious fascination of people who'd forgotten women existed. They tracked dirt across her clean floors. They left muddy boots on the porch instead of outside. They expected meals to appear without any thought to the work involved. Annie fed them anyway. Stew thick enough to stand a spoon in. Biscuits that actually rose. Coffee that didn't taste like it had been filtered through a saddle blanket. She served them without smiling, without making conversation, keeping herself as invisible as possible while doing work that was impossible to ignore. Clayton ate with them, sitting at the head of a table that had probably hosted his whole family once. He didn't talk much. Neither did the hands. Meals passed in silence, broken only by the scrape of forks and the occasional request for more. It was the third night before Annie realized what was missing. These men couldn't read. She'd left a note on the counter about supper being ready at 6. All 4 hands showed up at 5:30, looking confused and hungry and slightly angry, like she'd tried to trick them. Clayton had to read the note aloud, and even he stumbled over her handwriting. That night, after the dishes were done and the men had gone to the bunkhouse, Annie sat in the kitchen with a book she'd pulled from her satchel. It was worn, loved, read so many times the spine had given up. She'd taught from this book once. She'd read passages aloud to children who'd hung on every word, their faces bright with the hunger to learn. Now those children were dead or scattered. The school was ash. And she was here, hiding, pretending to be someone who'd never taught anything to anyone. Didn't know housekeepers read. Annie jumped, nearly dropping the book. Clayton stood in the doorway, holding an empty coffee cup like he'd forgotten it was in his hand. "Sorry," he said quickly. "Didn't mean to startle you. Just came for more coffee. Couldn't sleep." "It's your house," Annie said, closing the book but keeping one finger inside to mark her place. "You don't need to apologize for being in it." Clayton poured coffee, then surprised her by sitting down at the table instead of leaving. "What are you reading?" She showed him the cover. Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. "Never read it," Clayton said. "Never read much of anything, really. My father believed in working, not reading. Said books were for people too soft for real labor." "That's unfortunate," Annie said before she could stop herself. Clayton smiled, just a little. "You think so?" "Reading opens worlds," Annie said carefully. "Teaches things work alone can't. Your father was probably a practical man, but practical and wise aren't always the same thing." She waited for him to take offense. Instead, Clayton looked at the book like it was something dangerous and appealing at the same time. "Would you read some?" he asked. "Out loud, I mean. Just for a bit. I'm curious." So Annie read. She read about London and Paris, about the best of times and the worst of times, about revolution and sacrifice and people caught between worlds they couldn't control. Clayton listened like a man drinking water after days in the desert, his coffee going cold in his hands. When she stopped, he didn't move for a long moment. "That's beautiful," he said finally. "Sad, but beautiful. I never knew words could do that." "They can do more," Annie said. "If you'd like, I could—" She stopped herself. Offering to teach was the same as revealing who she really was. Teachers taught, housekeepers cleaned, but Clayton was looking at her with something like hope. "Could what?" "Teach you," Annie finished quietly. "To read better, I mean." "If you wanted." "I can read," Clayton said, defensive. "Just not well, or fast, or—" He laughed, bitter. "I can't read worth a damn, Miss Dalton. My father made sure I could sign my name and count money and not much else." "Then I could help," Annie said. "If you wanted, no charge, just something to do in the evenings." Clayton studied her. "Why would you do that?" Because teaching was the only thing Annie had ever been good at. Because she missed it like missing a limb. Because every time she heard ignorance defended as virtue, something inside her caught fire all over again. "Because knowledge shouldn't be a luxury," she said instead. "And because you're paying me to keep house, but the housework's done by 7. I have time." They started the next evening. Just Clayton, sitting at the kitchen table while Annie worked through basic grammar and vocabulary, correcting gently, encouraging constantly. He was quick to learn and hungry for it, making up for lost time with the intensity of someone who'd finally been given permission to want something his father had forbidden. The ranch hands noticed. Of course they noticed. Tom, the youngest at 23, lingered after breakfast one morning while the others headed out. "Miss Dalton," he said, awkward and hopeful. "If you're teaching Mr. Ridge to read better, would you teach me too? I never learned much. Can write my name. That's about all." Annie's chest tightened. This was dangerous. The more people she taught, the more she became herself instead of the ghost she was supposed to be. But Tom looked at her the same way her students in Ohio used to look before the fire took them. After supper, Annie said, "Bring the others if they want to learn." That night, all 4 ranch hands crowded into the kitchen with Clayton, watching Annie write the alphabet on a slate board she'd found in the barn. They were terrible students, restless, frustrated, embarrassed by how little they knew. But they were trying, and trying was enough. Word spread. By the end of the month, 2 neighboring ranch hands started showing up at 7:30, hat in hand, asking if there was room for 2 more. Then a farmer's wife brought her 3 children, desperate for any kind of education the frontier couldn't provide. Annie's kitchen became a schoolhouse without walls. She taught reading, writing, basic arithmetic. She read literature aloud and watched grown men discover poetry for the first time. She helped children sound out words and saw their faces light up when meaning finally clicked into place. For the first time since Ohio, Annie felt like herself, which meant she was in terrible danger. It was Clayton who noticed her fear. 2 months in, after a particularly successful evening where Tom had read an entire paragraph without help and everyone had applauded, Clayton stayed behind while the others left. "You're scared," he said. Not a question. Annie's hand stilled on the slate she was cleaning. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do," Clayton said gently. "You're teaching like someone who knows this can't last. Looking at the door every time someone new shows up, jumping at sudden noises. I've seen soldiers with that look, people running from something." Annie set down the slate carefully. "If I were running from something, would you want to know what it was?" Clayton considered this. "Depends. Did you hurt someone?" "No." "Did you steal anything?" "No." "Then I don't need to know," Clayton said. "But Annie," he used her first name carefully, like testing whether she'd allow it. "Whatever you're afraid of, it's eating you alive. You're the best thing that's happened to this ranch in years. You've brought life back to a place that was dying. The men are learning. The house is a home again. I wake up in the morning and don't hate the day ahead." He paused. "I'd hate to see you run from that because of something in your past." "What if my past catches up?" Annie asked. "Then we'll deal with it," Clayton said. "Together." It was an impossible promise, sweet and stupid and exactly what Annie wanted to believe. She'd been alone so long that the idea of someone standing with her instead of against her felt like a fantasy. But Clayton looked at her like he meant it, like she was worth defending, like she mattered. Annie wanted to tell him everything: the school, the fire, the children who'd died, the accusations that had chased her west with nothing but what she could carry, the wanted posters she'd seen in the last town before taking the stagecoach here, her face sketched from memory but recognizable enough to make her stomach drop. Instead, she said, "Thank you for giving me a chance when you didn't have to." "Thank you for taking it," Clayton said. "This place was just walls and roof before you got here. Now it's something worth keeping." He left before she could respond. Annie stood in the empty kitchen, surrounded by slate boards and books and the remnants of an evening's education, and felt tears she'd been holding back for months finally break free. She was building something here, something real. But real things could burn just as easily as old things, and Annie knew better than anyone how fast a fire could spread. Spring turned toward summer. The lessons continued. Annie's students grew in number and ability. Local children started showing up regularly, their parents grateful for any education at all. The ranch hands began reading dime novels to each other in the bunkhouse, stumbling through words but getting better every week. Clayton spent more time in the house, helping Annie prepare lessons, listening when she read aloud, asking questions that showed he was thinking deeper than the words on the page. They talked during those evenings, really talked, about books and ideas and the kind of life they'd both hoped to live before circumstances got in the way. He told her about his father, a hard man who'd built the ranch through sheer will and expected his son to maintain it the same way. About the loneliness of running a place too big for one person but too small to escape. About dreams he'd set aside because practical men didn't dream. Annie talked carefully around her past, giving him pieces that were true but incomplete. She'd been a teacher. She'd loved it. She'd lost everything in a fire. She'd come west to start over. All true, just missing the parts that would make him look at her differently. "You should open a real school," Clayton said one evening. They were sitting on the porch while fireflies started their evening dance across the prairie. Not just kitchen lessons, a proper building, books, desks, everything those kids deserve. That takes money, Annie said. I have some saved, Clayton said. Not much, but enough to start. We could build something small. You could teach properly. Maybe get paid for it instead of doing this out of kindness. Annie's throat tightened. Why would you do that? Clayton looked at her like the answer should be obvious. Because you're brilliant at it. Because these people need it. Because... He stopped, seemed to wrestle with something, then continued. Because watching you teach is like watching someone become who they were always meant to be. I don't know your whole story, Annie, but I know you were born to do this. You barely know me, Annie whispered. I know enough, Clayton said. I know you're kind. I know you're patient. I know you care about people others have given up on. I know you make this place feel less empty. He turned to look at her fully. I know I'd like you to stay. Not just as a housekeeper, as whatever you'd like to be. It was as close to a declaration as a careful man could make. Annie felt it settle over her like a coat she desperately wanted to wear, but knew she couldn't keep. Clayton, she said carefully, there are things you don't know about me, things that could cause problems if they came out. Then tell me, Clayton said, or don't. Either way, I'm not changing my mind. Annie looked at him. This good, lonely man who'd given her a chance when no one else would. Who'd let her teach when teaching was supposed to be behind her forever. Who looked at her like she was worth something despite all the evidence to the contrary. She should tell him. If she had any courage at all, she'd tell him everything and let him decide whether she was worth the risk. Instead, she said, Let me think about the school. It's a generous offer. I just need time. Clayton nodded, accepting the deflection. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. But Annie knew better. Time was the one thing she didn't have. Somewhere, people were still looking for her. Somewhere, her face was still on wanted posters. Somewhere, the truth about the fire was still buried under lies. And building a school, becoming visible, becoming official, would be like lighting a beacon for everyone hunting her. That night, Annie lay in bed and tried to imagine a future where she could stay, where she could teach openly without fear, where Clayton's careful affection could become something real instead of something she'd have to abandon. She couldn't picture it. Every version of the future she built ended the same way, with marshals at the door, accusations in the air, and Clayton looking at her like she'd lied to him, which she had. By omission, by silence, by pretending to be someone simple instead of someone wanted. Annie pulled the blanket up and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her. This place had become home faster than anywhere she'd ever lived. These people had become hers. Clayton had become... She couldn't finish that thought. Finishing it would make leaving impossible, and leaving was the only way to keep everyone safe. But not yet. She'd stay a little longer, teach a little more, build something that might last even after she was gone. And if the marshals came tomorrow, at least she'd have had tonight. The knock came 2 weeks later, just after breakfast. Annie was washing dishes when she heard horses outside. Too many horses for a social call. Through the window, she saw 3 men dismounting. One wore a badge that caught the morning sun like a threat. Her hands went numb. The plate she was holding slipped into the water. Annie? Clayton appeared in the doorway. You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. There's a marshal outside, Annie managed. Yeah, I see him, Clayton said, unconcerned. Probably looking for someone. Happens sometimes. I'll handle it. He didn't understand. Annie gripped the edge of the sink, fighting the urge to run straight out the back door and keep running until Kansas was behind her. But she'd promised herself she wouldn't run anymore, that she'd face whatever came. She dried her hands on her apron and followed Clayton to the front door. The marshal was older, weathered, with the patient look of a man who'd tracked enough people to know they always made mistakes eventually. He tipped his hat when he saw them. Morning, he said. I'm Marshal Booker, looking for someone. Wondered if either of you might have seen her. He pulled out a folded paper and opened it. Annie's face stared back at her, sketched but unmistakable. Underneath, in bold letters, wanted for questioning, arson and manslaughter. Clayton went very still beside her. Annie felt the world narrow to just that poster, that face, that terrible moment of recognition. That's quite a serious charge, Clayton said carefully. His voice gave nothing away. It is, Marshal Booker agreed. Woman taught school back in Ohio. Place burned down, killed 3 children. She disappeared the night of the fire. Been tracking her ever since. He looked at Annie. You look familiar, miss. Have we met? Annie's mouth went dry. This was it. The moment everything ended. But before she could speak, Clayton stepped slightly forward, putting himself between her and the marshal in a way that looked casual, but wasn't. My housekeeper's name is Annie Dalton, Clayton said. From Missouri originally. Been working here 3 months. Excellent references. Mind if I speak with her? Marshal Booker asked. I mind if you accuse her of murder without cause, Clayton said, his voice hardening. That poster shows someone who looks like half the women in Kansas. Unless you've got proof she's the person you're hunting, I'd appreciate you moving along. The marshal's eyes narrowed. Interesting that you're so protective of hired help, Mr. Ridge. I protect what's mine, Clayton said flatly. She works for me. That makes her my responsibility. Annie's heart was hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. She should confess. Should save Clayton from lying for her. Should face whatever came instead of hiding behind a man who didn't know what he was defending. But the words wouldn't come. Marshal Booker studied them both for a long moment. Then he folded the poster and tucked it back into his coat. I'll be in the area a few more days, he said. If you hear anything, I'm staying at the hotel in town. Rewards substantial for anyone who helps bring her in. He tipped his hat again, mounted his horse, and rode off with his companions. Clayton didn't move until they were out of sight. Then he turned to Annie, and the look on his face was something between betrayal and determination. Inside, he said quietly. Now. Annie followed him into the house on legs that barely held her. Clayton closed the door and faced her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he looked angry. Tell me, he said. Everything. Right now. So Annie told him. About the school she'd loved, about the fire that had destroyed it, about the children who'd died despite her desperate attempts to save them, about the accusations that had followed, the whispers that she'd started it for insurance money, the town turning against her overnight, about running with nothing but books and guilt, certain that staying would mean hanging for a crime she didn't commit. She told him everything, and when she finished, Clayton was silent for so long, Annie was certain he was trying to figure out how to turn her in without breaking whatever promise he'd made to himself about protecting her. Instead, he said, Did you start that fire? No, Annie said. Did you try to save those children? Yes, I tried. I failed, but I tried. Clayton nodded once, sharp and decisive. Then we're not giving you up. Clayton! No, he cut her off. I meant what I said. You're mine to protect. That marshal can suspect whatever he wants, but he doesn't have proof. If he did, he'd have arrested you instead of asking questions. He'll come back, Annie said. He'll keep looking. Let him look, Clayton said fiercely. You're staying. We'll figure out the rest. Annie wanted to argue, wanted to explain that staying would only put him in danger. But the relief of being believed, of not being immediately rejected, was too overwhelming. Why? She whispered. Why would you risk this for me? Clayton crossed the space between them and took her hands in his. They were rough, work-worn, steady. Because I've watched you for 3 months, he said. I've seen how you treat people, how you care, how you teach like every student matters more than your own safety. That's not the behavior of someone who kills children, Annie. That's the behavior of someone who loved them. He believed her. Against all reason, without proof, he believed her. Annie felt something break inside her chest, some tight, scared thing she'd been carrying since Ohio. Tears came fast and hard, and Clayton pulled her against him, letting her cry into his shirt while he held her steady. We'll fix this, he promised. Somehow. I don't know how yet, but we will. You're not alone anymore. And for the first time in months, Annie let herself believe that might actually be true. The days after Marshal Booker's visit moved differently. Slower in some ways, faster in others. Annie caught herself looking over her shoulder at sounds that used to mean nothing. A horse on the road, boots on the porch, voices carrying from town. Every stranger became a threat. Every knock at the door became the moment everything would fall apart. Clayton noticed. Of course he noticed. He'd started watching her the way you'd watch a spooked horse, careful and steady, trying not to make sudden moves. You're going to wear a hole in that floor, he said one morning, finding her pacing the kitchen before dawn. And you didn't sleep. I heard you moving around all night. Annie stopped, embarrassed to be caught. I'm fine. You're terrified, Clayton corrected. He poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. And I don't blame you, but running yourself ragged won't help. What will help? Annie asked, more sharply than she intended. Pretending that Marshall won't come back? Pretending someone in town won't recognize my face and decide that reward money looks good? Clayton sat down at the table, gesturing for her to do the same. No, we prepare. We think ahead. We don't panic. Easy for you to say. You're not the one wanted for murder. Manslaughter, Clayton said. And questioning, not convicted. Words matter, Annie. If they had evidence, that poster would say, arrest on sight, not wanted for questioning. Annie sat, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. You sound like you've thought about this. I have, Clayton admitted. All night, actually. While you were pacing upstairs, I was down here making lists. He pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket. Things we need to know, things we need to do, ways to protect you if Booker comes back with more than suspicions. Annie unfolded the paper. Clayton's handwriting was rough but readable. He'd been practicing. The list was thorough, almost too thorough. Find out what evidence they have. Get a lawyer. Document Annie's whereabouts. Get character witnesses. Find out who really started the fire. You can't do this, Annie said quietly. Clayton, if you help me and they find out, you could be charged with harboring a fugitive. You could lose the ranch. You could... I know the risks, Clayton interrupted. I'm taking them anyway. Why? Annie's voice cracked. I'm not worth this. Clayton reached across the table and took the list back, then took her hand instead. Yeah, you are, and I'm not debating this with you. You're staying. We're fighting. End of discussion. His certainty should have been comforting. Instead, it made Annie feel like she was drowning him along with herself. But she didn't pull her hand away. The lessons continued that evening because stopping would have raised questions Annie couldn't answer. Tom and the other ranch hands crowded into the kitchen as usual, along with the Miller children and old Frank Carson, who'd decided at 63 that he was tired of making an X where his signature should go. Annie taught like everything was normal. She corrected spelling, praised progress, read passages from Twain that made everyone laugh. For 2 hours, she almost forgot about marshals and wanted posters, and the fact that her face was circulating through every town between here and Ohio. Almost. Miss Annie? Sarah Miller, 10 years old and sharp as a tack, raised her hand. Are you all right? You seem sad. The room went quiet. Everyone looked at Annie, and she realized she'd been staring at the same page for too long without reading. I'm fine, Sarah, Annie said, forcing a smile. Just tired. It's been a long day. My ma says you work too hard, Sarah continued. She says Mr. Ridge should give you more help. Your ma should mind her business, Clayton said, but he was smiling when he said it. Though she's not wrong, Annie does work too hard. I like working, Annie said, which was true. Work kept her hands busy and her mind from spiraling into panic. Now, who wants to read next? Tom volunteered, stumbling through a paragraph about a riverboat that ran aground. He'd improved tremendously in 3 months. They all had. These rough, hard men who'd never been given a chance to learn were reading actual books now, slowly but genuinely. It made everything worse somehow. Knowing that when she inevitably had to run, she'd be abandoning them mid-education, leaving them with half-finished lessons and no explanation except that their teacher had been lying to them all along. After everyone left, Annie stayed in the kitchen longer than necessary, cleaning things that were already clean. Clayton appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. You're thinking about running, he said. Annie's hand stilled on the slate she was wiping. I'm thinking about what happens when I don't run. When Booker finds proof or someone recognizes me, or then we deal with it, Clayton said. Together, like I told you. You keep saying that, Annie said, turning to face him, but you don't understand what you're signing up for. If they arrest me, if they take me back to Ohio, you'll be the man who harbored a wanted woman. Your reputation will be destroyed. Your ranch is just a ranch, Clayton cut her off. Wood and land. It'll survive whatever comes. But you won't, Annie said desperately. Clayton, they could charge you as an accomplice. They could... Clayton crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and took her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Annie, listen to me. I spent 6 months after my father died wondering if this ranch was worth keeping, wondering if I should just sell it and move somewhere that didn't feel like a graveyard. Then you showed up." He paused, making sure she was hearing him. "You brought this place back to life. You brought me back to life. So no, I'm not letting you run. I'm not letting some marshal with a sketch and a grudge take that away. Mutpi?" "It's not just about you," Annie whispered. "I know," Clayton said. "It's about Tom learning to read. It's about Sarah Miller getting an education. It's about every person you've helped in 3 months. They need you. And whether you want to admit it or not, you need them too." He was right. Annie had been so focused on running, on protecting herself, that she'd forgotten what she was running from. Not just the law, not just the accusations, but the loss of purpose, the loss of mattering to anyone. Here, she mattered. These people needed her, and she needed them more than she'd needed anything in years. "I'm scared," Annie admitted. "Good," Clayton said. "Means you're smart. But being scared and being paralyzed aren't the same thing. We can be scared and still fight back." "How?" Clayton released her shoulders but didn't step back. "We start by finding out what really happened in Ohio. Someone set that fire, Annie. If it wasn't you, then whoever did it is still out there, maybe still free. And if we can prove that, if we can find evidence—" "It's been months," Annie interrupted. "The trail is cold. The witnesses are gone." "Clayton, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but nothing," Clayton said firmly. "You gave up once, ran instead of fighting. I'm not judging you for that. You were alone and scared and probably right to run, but you're not alone now. And I don't give up on things I care about." The weight of that statement hung between them. Things I care about, not people, not you. Things, like Annie was a project instead of a person. Except the way Clayton was looking at her didn't feel like a project. It felt like something deeper and more dangerous than either of them was ready to name. "I'll write some letters," Clayton said, stepping back and giving them both breathing room. "Reach out to people I know back east. See what information I can gather. Meanwhile, you keep teaching. Keep being exactly who you are. If we act guilty, we look guilty. But if we act like you've got nothing to hide—" "I do have something to hide," Annie said. "You have something to prove," Clayton corrected. "Different thing entirely." Over the next 2 weeks, Clayton became a man with a mission. He wrote letters to lawyers, to investigators, to anyone who might have information about the Ohio fire. He rode into town 3 times to send telegrams, always coming back tight-lipped and frustrated, but not defeated. Annie taught. She expanded her evening lessons to include basic science, history, even a bit of poetry that made the ranch hands uncomfortable until she explained it in terms they understood. She read Shakespeare and made it sound like a barroom brawl. She taught geometry using cattle fencing as examples. The students multiplied. Word had spread beyond the immediate area. Families started arriving from 10, 15 miles away, desperate for any education the territory couldn't provide. Annie's kitchen could barely hold everyone. "We need more space," Tom said one evening, looking at the crowded room. "This is getting dangerous. One of these days, someone's going to get trampled trying to see the chalkboard." "I've been thinking about that," Clayton said. He'd started attending the lessons openly now, sitting in the back and taking notes like any other student. "The old barn's half empty. We could clear it out, build some benches, make a proper schoolroom." "That's a lot of work," Annie said carefully. "So?" Clayton looked at her. "We've got time and hands. Tom, you and the boys interested in building something that matters?" The 4 ranch hands exchanged looks. Then Tom nodded. Yeah, we are." "Then we start tomorrow," Clayton said. Annie wanted to protest, wanted to point out that building a school was the opposite of staying invisible, that it would make her even easier to find, that it was a waste of effort when she might have to run any day. But looking at the faces around her, Tom and the hands, Sarah Miller and her siblings, old Frank Carson, even Clayton, she couldn't bring herself to say it. These people believed in something, believed in her. Refusing them felt like refusing herself. "All right," Annie said quietly. "We'll build a school." The work started at dawn. Tom and the ranch hands cleared the old barn of everything except the frame. They hauled out broken equipment, rotted hay, years of accumulated debris. Clayton measured and planned, sketching rough designs on paper. Annie helped where she could, but mostly she watched these rough frontiermen transform into builders. They argued over measurements, debated bench heights, corrected each other's mistakes with the easy camaraderie of people working towards something bigger than themselves. Women from neighboring farms started appearing with food, supplies, encouragement. Mrs. Miller brought fabric for curtains. Mrs. Carson donated an old desk her father had used. Even people who didn't have children in the lessons contributed. Nails, wood, labor, time. The community was building something together, and Annie was at the center of it, terrified and grateful in equal measure. "This is crazy," she told Clayton one afternoon. They were taking a break, watching Tom and Frank wrestle a beam into place. "We're building a target. Every person who comes here is another person who might recognize me. Or another person who'll vouch for you," Clayton said. "Annie, you're thinking about this wrong. These people aren't threats. They're witnesses to who you really are." "Who I really am is a woman wanted for killing children," Annie said bitterly. Clayton turned to face her. "No. Who you really are is a woman who teaches ranch hands to read at night, who makes 10-year-old girls believe they can learn anything, who turned my dying ranch into a place worth living." He paused. "Who you really are is someone those children in Ohio loved, someone who tried to save them. That's the truth, Annie. The rest is just lies people told about you." Annie wanted to believe him, but belief required hope, and hope was dangerous when you were one recognition away from a noose. The barn conversion took 3 weeks. When it was finished, it wasn't fancy. Rough benches, a salvaged chalkboard, windows that didn't quite fit their frames, but it was real. A genuine schoolhouse, born from need and built by people who'd never had one before. The first official class was chaos. 30 people showed up, from 6-year-olds to 60-year-olds, all crammed into a space meant for maybe 20. Annie had to teach 3 different levels simultaneously, jumping between basic alphabet and advanced reading, between arithmetic and history. It should have been exhausting. It was. But it was also the most alive Annie had felt since before the fire. "You're glowing," Clayton said that evening. Everyone had left, and Annie was organizing books for the next day's lessons. "I don't think I've ever seen you look this happy." "I'm not happy," Annie said automatically. "I'm happy," Clayton repeated firmly. "You can be scared and happy at the same time, Annie. One doesn't cancel out the other." Maybe he was right. Annie had spent so long running from her past that she'd forgotten what it felt like to build a future. Teaching in a proper schoolroom, even a rough frontier version, reminded her why she'd become a teacher in the first place. These people were hungry to learn, desperate for it, and she could feed that hunger in ways no one else around here could. "Thank you," Annie said quietly, "for building this, for believing in it." "I didn't build it for the school," Clayton said. "I built it for you." The honesty in his voice made Annie's chest tight. She set down the books and turned to face him properly. "Clayton, I know," he said quickly. "You're not ready. Or you don't think you can be ready. Or you think I'm only helping because I feel responsible. But Annie, I need you to know—" He stopped, struggling for words. "What I feel for you is an obligation. It's not pity. It's—" "Don't," Annie interrupted. "Please don't say it." "Why not?" "Because if you say it, it becomes real," Annie said desperately. "And if it's real, I can't leave. And Clayton, I might have to leave. Any day, any moment, everything could fall apart. You can't, we can't." Clayton crossed the space between them. "I love you." Annie's breath caught. "Clayton, I love you," he repeated, stronger this time. "I've probably loved you since the night you read Dickens in my kitchen and made me realize I'd been half asleep my whole life. I love watching you teach. I love the way you make people believe they're capable of more than they thought. I love that you're scared but doing this anyway." He paused. "And I love you enough to let you run if you need to. But I need you to know first. Need you to understand that someone sees exactly who you are and loves you anyway." Tears blurred Annie's vision. She'd spent months believing no one would ever look at her without seeing the fire first, the accusations first, the wanted poster first. But Clayton was looking at her like none of that mattered, like she was just Annie, just herself. "I can't promise you a future," Annie whispered. "I'm not asking for promises," Clayton said. "I'm just asking you to let me stand with you, whatever comes." Annie had 2 choices. She could protect them both by pushing him away, keeping distance between them so when she inevitably had to run, It would hurt less. Or she could take what he was offering and hope it would be enough to carry them through whatever was coming. She chose wrong. Or right. She'd probably never know which. Annie reached up and kissed him. It wasn't smooth or perfect. Their noses bumped. She was still crying. He was clearly surprised. But when Clayton's arms came around her, when he kissed her back like she was something precious he'd been afraid to touch, Annie felt something loosen in her chest that had been locked tight since Ohio. Maybe this was stupid. Maybe she was dragging him into danger. Maybe loving him back was the most selfish thing she could do. But for once, Annie chose to be selfish. They broke apart, and Clayton rested his forehead against hers. So that's a yes? That's an I love you too, but I'm terrified, Annie said. I'll take it, Clayton said. They stood there in the rough schoolhouse they'd built together, holding each other while the Kansas sunset painted the walls gold. And Annie let herself imagine a future where this lasted, where she got to teach and love and live without always looking over her shoulder. It was a beautiful dream. It lasted exactly 3 more days. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Clayton brought it back from town with the regular mail, his face tight in a way that made Annie's stomach drop before he even handed it to her. The return address was a law office in Cincinnati. Annie's hands shook as she opened it. The letter was formal, legal, and devastating. New evidence had emerged regarding the school fire. A witness had come forward claiming to have seen Annie near the building before the fire started, carrying what appeared to be an oil lamp. The investigation was being reopened. A warrant for her arrest had been issued. The marshal would be back within the week to take her into custody. Annie read it twice, then a third time, hoping the words would change. They didn't. Annie? Clayton's voice came from far away. What does it say? She handed him the letter without speaking. Watched his face as he read it, watched the anger and fear and determination cycle through his expression. This is garbage, Clayton said flatly. A witness after all this time? Convenient. Someone's lying, or they're telling the truth, Annie said numbly. Clayton, I did have a lamp that night. I was working late, grading papers. Maybe someone did see me. Maybe it looks suspicious. Did you start the fire? No. Then we fight this, Clayton said. We get a lawyer. We demand to know who this witness is. Clayton, stop. Annie's voice cracked. It's over. They have a witness. They have a warrant. Running won't work anymore. The best thing I can do is turn myself in and hope the truth comes out at trial. And if it doesn't? Clayton demanded. Annie, you could hang for this. You could... He couldn't finish the sentence. I know, Annie whispered. But what choice do I have? Clayton crumpled the letter in his fist. You have the choice to fight, to let me help you. You've already helped, Annie said, more than I deserved. But this is my problem, Clayton, my past catching up. I won't drag you down with it. Too late, Clayton said fiercely. I'm already involved. I'm already in this. You think I'm just going to hand you over to some marshal and go back to ranching like nothing happened? Yes, Annie said, because anything else ruins you too. You're not listening, Clayton said. He grabbed her shoulders, gentle but firm. Annie, I don't care about ruin. I care about you, and I'm not losing you without a fight. The conviction in his voice was almost enough to make Annie believe they had a chance. Almost. The marshal comes in less than a week, Annie said. What can we possibly do in that time? Everything, Clayton said. He meant it. Over the next 4 days, Clayton became a force of nature. He wrote to every lawyer within 200 miles. He interviewed everyone who'd interacted with Annie since she arrived, getting signed statements about her character. He rode to 3 different towns, gathering information, following leads, refusing to sleep more than a few hours at a time. Tom and the ranch hands helped, spreading word through the community about what was happening. Within 2 days, they had dozens of letters from families praising Annie's teaching, her character, her impact on their lives. None of this matters if there's a witness saying she started the fire, Annie said, watching Clayton organize statements on the kitchen table. Then we find out who the witness is, Clayton said, and we prove they're lying. How? I don't know yet, Clayton admitted, but we will. Annie wanted to believe him, but belief required energy she didn't have. She'd spent the last 4 days teaching like normal during the day, pretending everything was fine while her students looked at her with worry they were too young or too polite to voice. At night, she lay awake imagining the trial. Imagining standing in front of a judge while people she'd never met described her as a murderer. Imagining the moment they found her guilty despite being innocent. Imagining never seeing Clayton again. On the fifth day, Dr. Harrison arrived at the ranch unannounced. Annie had met him once before. He'd treated Tom for a broken finger and stayed for supper. Middle-aged, competent, with the tired kindness of a man who'd seen too much suffering. "Mr. Ridge," Dr. Harrison said, dismounting quickly, "I heard about Miss Dalton's situation. I have information that might help." Clayton appeared from the barn so fast he must have been watching the road. "What kind of information?" "I served in Ohio before coming west," Dr. Harrison said. "Different town from where the fire happened, but close enough. I remember the incident. There was talk even then that the investigation was rushed, that certain business interests wanted the school property for development." Annie's heart stuttered. "What?" "The school sat on valuable land," Dr. Harrison said. "Prime location for commercial development. Multiple offers had been made to the county to sell, but the school board refused. Then the fire happened, conveniently clearing the property." He pulled papers from his bag. "I've been writing to colleagues back east since I heard about your trouble. They've sent me newspaper clippings, records. Miss Dalton, I don't think that fire was an accident, and I don't think you were the target of the investigation by chance." Clayton grabbed the papers, scanning them rapidly. "This says 3 different businesses had offered to buy the land in the year before the fire. And one of them purchased it 2 months after," Dr. Harrison said, "at a fraction of what they'd offered before. Fire damage made it cheap." Annie felt like the ground was shifting under her feet. "You're saying someone burned the school for profit?" "I'm saying it's possible," Dr. Harrison said carefully, "and worth investigating. If we can prove the fire was deliberately set by someone with financial motive, then Annie's not the only suspect," Clayton finished. His face was alight with something Annie hadn't seen in days: hope. "Dr. Harrison, this is exactly what we needed." "It's not proof," Annie said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's speculation." "It's reasonable doubt," Clayton corrected. "It's a starting point, and it's more than we had an hour ago." Dr. Harrison nodded. "I've sent telegrams to the authorities in Ohio requesting they investigate these business dealings. But, Miss Dalton, I must be honest. This won't stop the marshal from taking you. At best, it might help your case at trial." "Then we'll use it at trial," Clayton said firmly. "Annie, this is good news." It should have felt like good news, but Annie had learned not to trust hope. Hope was what got you hurt when reality came crashing back. Still, looking at Clayton's face, at the determination written in every line of his body, Annie couldn't bring herself to crush his optimism. "Thank you, Dr. Harrison," she said quietly. "Truly." The doctor tipped his hat. "I'll keep gathering information. If I find anything else, I'll send word immediately." After he left, Clayton turned to Annie with an expression that was equal parts triumph and fear. "We have a chance." "We have a maybe," Annie corrected. "Clayton, please, don't what? Don't hope? Don't fight?" Clayton moved closer. "Annie, I know you're scared. I know you've been burned before. But giving up now means they win. Means whoever really started that fire gets away with it. Means you spend the rest of your life running or in prison for something you didn't do." "Maybe I deserve it," Annie whispered. "Those children died because I couldn't save them." Clayton took her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You tried to save them. That's not guilt, Annie. That's tragedy, and you've spent enough time punishing yourself for it." Annie wanted to argue, wanted to explain that trying wasn't enough, that failure was still failure, that she'd live with those deaths forever, regardless of what any investigation proved. But Clayton was looking at her like she mattered, like her life was worth fighting for, and Annie was so tired of fighting alone. "Okay," she said finally. "We try." Clayton kissed her forehead. "We try." The marshal arrived 2 days later with a federal warrant and an apologetic expression that didn't quite hide his certainty. Annie was guilty in his mind. The warrant just made it official. "Miss Dalton," Marshal Booker said, standing in the doorway with 2 deputies flanking him, "I'm here to escort you back to Ohio to stand trial for arson and manslaughter." Annie had prepared for this. She'd packed a small bag. She'd said private goodbyes to her students, telling them she'd be back even though she probably wouldn't. She'd held Clayton the night before and memorized what it felt like to be loved by someone good. Now she stood straight and met the marshal's eyes. I understand. Like hell you do, Clayton said, stepping forward. Marshal, we have evidence suggesting— Mr. Ridge, Booker interrupted, not unkindly. Whatever evidence you think you have, it needs to be presented at trial. My job is to bring Miss Dalton in. The rest is up to the courts. She'll run, one of the deputies said. She ran before. I won't run, Annie said clearly. I'm going willingly. Clayton looked at her like she'd just stabbed him. Annie. It's all right, Annie said, trying to sound braver than she felt. I'm not running anymore. The marshal produced manacles. Annie held out her wrists, refusing to flinch when cold metal closed around them. She was a criminal now. Officially. Publicly. The students were gathered outside. 30 people who'd learned from her, believed in her, trusted her. They watched in silence as Marshal Booker led Annie toward the wagon. Sarah Miller was crying. Tom looked furious. Old Frank Carson stood with his hat in his hands, looking lost. Clayton walked beside her, ignoring the marshal's warnings to keep back. I'm coming with you, he said. To Ohio. I'll testify. I'll get you a lawyer. You'll stay here, Annie said firmly. The ranch needs you. The school needs you. These people need you. I need you, Clayton said desperately. Annie stopped, forcing Booker to stop too. She looked at Clayton and tried to memorize his face. Every line, every expression, every piece of the man she loved and was about to lose. Then fight for me here, Annie said. Keep gathering evidence. Keep pushing the investigation. Be my voice when I can't speak for myself. Annie, promise me, Annie interrupted. Promise you won't give up. Clayton's jaw worked. Then he nodded, sharp and angry and heartbroken. I promise. Booker helped Annie into the wagon. She sat between the two deputies, manacles heavy on her wrists, watching Clayton and the school and everything she'd built get smaller as they pulled away. She didn't let herself cry until they were out of sight. Then she cried silently, tears running down her face while the deputies pretended not to notice, and tried to believe that somehow, against impossible odds, Clayton would find a way to save her. Because she couldn't save herself anymore. She was done running, done hiding. Whatever came next, Annie would face it standing still. Even if standing still meant standing trial for murder. The jail cell in Millbrook, Ohio smelled like rust and old fear. Annie sat on the thin mattress with her back against the cold stone wall, counting the days by scratches she made with a loose nail she'd found in the corner. 7 days since Marshal Booker delivered her. 7 days of waiting while lawyers she couldn't afford argued over her fate. The preliminary hearing had been brief and brutal. The prosecutor laid out his case with the confidence of a man who'd already won. Annie Dalton, schoolteacher. Present the night of the fire. Seen carrying a lamp near the building hours before it burned. Fled the jurisdiction immediately after. 3 children dead. Clear case of arson and manslaughter, possibly murder if they could prove intent. The defense attorney assigned to her was young, overworked, and clearly didn't believe a word she said. He went through the motions, objected when required, cross-examined weakly, made arguments that sounded hollow even to Annie's desperate ears. The judge set trial for 3 weeks out. Bail was denied. Flight risk, the prosecutor said. History of running. Annie sat in the defendant's chair and said nothing, because what was there to say? Everything they claimed was technically true, even if the conclusion was wrong. Now she waited. The cell had one small window too high to reach, showing a square of sky that changed from blue to gray to black, and back again. Annie watched it obsessively, marking time, trying not to think about Clayton or the school or the life she'd been ripped away from. But thinking was all she had. The other prisoners were mostly drunks and petty thieves, rotating through cells on either side of hers. They came and went. Annie stayed. The guards treated her with careful distance, like she was dangerous. The woman who killed children. The monster hiding behind a teacher's face. Only one guard spoke to her regularly. Officer Brennan, older and tired, who brought meals and sometimes lingered to talk. You really do it? He asked one evening, sliding a tray through the slot. Kill those kids? No, Annie said. Brennan studied her. Most people in here say they're innocent, but you don't sound like you're trying to convince me. Would it matter if I tried? Annie asked. Probably not, Brennan admitted. But for what it's worth, I've been doing this 20 years. You don't look like a killer to me. You look like someone who got caught in something bigger than themselves." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to Annie since the arrest. She held on to it like a lifeline, repeating it in her head during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come and fear made her chest tight. The letters started arriving on the 9th day. The first was from Tom, written in his careful, improving handwriting. "Miss Annie, we're still learning. Mr. Ridge is teaching us like you would. We're fighting for you. Don't give up." Then Sarah Miller, her spelling shaky, but her message clear. "You didn't do it. Everyone knows. Come home soon." Then more. Frank Carson, Mrs. Miller, families. Annie barely knew. Ranch hands from neighboring spreads. All of them saying the same thing. "We believe you. We're waiting. Come back." Annie read them until the paper wore thin, until she'd memorized every word. These people hadn't abandoned her, hadn't assumed guilt. They'd looked at what she'd done in Kansas and decided that mattered more than accusations from Ohio. It helped. Not enough, but some. Clayton's letter arrived on day 12. Annie's hands shook when she recognized his handwriting. She opened it carefully, afraid of what it might say. Afraid he'd come to his senses and realized loving a woman accused of murder was too much weight to carry. Instead, he'd written 3 pages of updates, evidence, hope. Dr. Harrison had uncovered more information about the business dealings surrounding the school property. A lawyer from Kansas City was reviewing the case. Tom and the ranch hands had been interviewing people from Annie's past, tracking down anyone who might testify to her character. And at the end, in handwriting that looked rushed, almost angry, "I love you. I'm not giving up. Don't you dare give up either." Annie pressed the letter against her chest and cried for the first time since the arrest. Not from despair. From the terrifying possibility that she might actually survive this. The prosecution's case was strong. Annie learned this from her defense attorney during their second meeting, held in a dim room that smelled like cigars and defeat. "They have a witness," Attorney Morris said, flipping through papers without looking at Annie. "Claims to have seen you near the school with an oil lamp around 9 in the evening. The fire started around 11. They'll argue you set it and left." "I was grading papers," Annie said. "I did have a lamp. I always worked late. But I didn't start any fire." "Can you prove where you were when the fire started?" "I was home, asleep, alone." Morris made a note. "That's not helpful." "It's the truth," Annie said. "Truth and proof aren't the same thing, Miss Dalton." Morris finally looked at her. "The prosecution will paint you as a desperate woman with debts, who saw insurance money as a way out. They'll say you were careless, that you didn't mean to kill anyone, but did anyway through negligence. Manslaughter instead of murder. Easier to prove, still gets you 20 years. Annie's stomach dropped. "I didn't have debts. I didn't need money. Can you prove that?" "My bank records were lost in the fire along with most county documents," Morris interrupted. "Convenient for the prosecution. They can claim anything, and you can't disprove it." Annie wanted to scream, wanted to overturn the table and demand to know how any of this was justice. But screaming wouldn't help. Nothing would help except evidence, and evidence seemed impossible to find. "What about the business interests Dr. Harrison uncovered?" Annie asked. "The companies that wanted the school property?" Morris waved a hand dismissively. "Speculation. No direct evidence they were involved in arson. And frankly, Miss Dalton, throwing accusations at wealthy businessmen when you're a penniless schoolteacher won't endear you to a jury." "So what's your strategy?" Annie demanded. "Character witnesses," Morris said. "Hope the jury believes you're not the type to kill children. Emphasize your teaching record, your dedication. Make them like you enough to doubt the evidence." It was a terrible strategy. Annie could see it in Morris's face. He knew it too. But what else was there? "The people from Kansas sent letters," Annie said. "Testimonials. Signed statements about my character, my teaching." "From Kansas," Morris interrupted, "after the alleged crime. The prosecution will argue you fooled them just like you fooled everyone in Ohio, that you're good at deception." Annie felt the walls closing in. "So, you're saying I'm going to be convicted?" Morris hesitated, then had the decency to look her in the eye. "I'm saying the odds aren't good. I'm sorry, Miss Dalton, I'll do my best. But you should prepare yourself for the possibility of prison time." After he left, Annie sat in the empty room and tried to imagine 20 years behind bars. 20 years of cells and guards and being known as the woman who killed children. 20 years without teaching, without books, without Clayton or the school, or anything that made life worth living. She couldn't picture it. Her mind rejected the image completely, like trying to imagine her own death. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in late summer. The courtroom was packed. Curious townspeople, reporters, people who'd lost children in the fire and wanted to see Annie pay for it. She walked to the defendant's table in shackles, trying to hold her head up, trying not to see the hatred in some of those faces. The judge was old, stern, and clearly unmoved by anything except the law. Judge Carmichael, known for harsh sentences and no patience for sob stories. Annie's heart sank when she saw him. The prosecutor, Mr. Whitmore, was everything Morris wasn't: confident, prepared, theatrical. He addressed the jury like they were old friends, building rapport before he'd even called his first witness. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitmore began, "this is a simple case. A woman, entrusted with the care and education of our children, betrayed that trust in the most horrific way imaginable. The evidence will show that Annie Dalton deliberately set fire to Greenfield School, resulting in the deaths of 3 innocent children. She didn't stay to face justice. She ran, like the guilty always run," Morris objected weakly. Judge Carmichael overruled. The trial had barely started, and Annie could already feel it slipping away. The prosecution's first witness was Margaret Fletcher, a woman who'd lived near the school. She testified that she'd seen Annie leaving the building around 9:30 the night of the fire, carrying what looked like an oil lamp. "Did she seem hurried?" Whitmore asked. "Yes," Margaret said, "like she was in a rush to leave." "Did you speak to her?" "I called out. She didn't respond. Just kept walking." Morris cross-examined, trying to establish that Margaret had poor eyesight, that the lighting had been bad, that she couldn't be certain it was Annie. Margaret held firm. She knew what she'd seen. The second witness was Thomas Ridgway, the fire inspector who'd investigated the scene. He described the burn patterns, the accelerant traces, the point of origin near Annie's classroom. Everything pointed to deliberate arson. "Could this fire have been accidental?" Whitmore asked. "Highly unlikely," Ridgway said. "The burn patterns suggest multiple ignition points. Someone wanted this building to burn fast and hot." Morris tried to poke holes in the investigation, suggesting other possible sources of ignition. Ridgway dismissed every theory. The fire was set. The only question was who set it. Annie sat through 3 days of testimony that painted her as a monster. Witnesses described her as distant, secretive, possibly unstable. The children who died were made real. Sweet Mary Thompson, age 7. James Carter, age 9. Little Emma Walsh, just 6 years old. Their parents testified through tears about the children they'd lost, and every word was another nail in Annie's coffin. Morris did his best. He called character witnesses who testified that Annie had been a dedicated teacher, beloved by students, never violent or careless. But their words sounded hollow against the weight of the prosecution's case. On the 4th day, everything changed. Annie was sitting at the defense table, half listening to another witness describe the fire's aftermath, when Officer Brennan appeared at the courtroom door. He was out of uniform, looking uncomfortable in a suit that didn't fit quite right. He scanned the room, caught Annie's eye, and gave her the smallest nod. Then he approached the prosecutor's table and handed Whitmore a telegram. Whitmore read it, and his confident expression faltered. He read it again, then showed it to his assistant. They had a whispered conversation that grew heated. Judge Carmichael noticed. "Mr. Whitmore," the judge said sharply, "do you have something to share with the court?" Whitmore stood slowly. "Your Honor, I request a brief recess. New information has just come to light that requires investigation." "What kind of information?" Carmichael demanded. Whitmore hesitated, clearly struggling. "I need time to verify its authenticity before bringing it before the court." Morris stood. "Your Honor, if the prosecution has exculpatory evidence, they're required to disclose it immediately." "It's not necessarily exculpatory," Whitmore said quickly. "It's merely unexpected." Judge Carmichael looked between them, annoyed. "Mr. Whitmore, either share what you've learned or continue with your case. I won't tolerate delays based on vague claims." Whitmore glanced at the telegram again, then at Annie. For the first time since the trial began, he looked uncertain. "Your Honor," Whitmore said slowly, "I've just received word that a man in Columbus has confessed to setting the Greenfield School fire." The courtroom erupted. Judge Carmichael banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Annie's heart stopped, then started again, too fast. Morris grabbed her arm, his eyes wide with shock. What? Morris demanded. Who? When? I don't have details, Whitmore said over the noise. Just this telegram from the Columbus police. A man named Robert Finch has confessed to arson, claims he was hired to burn the school by parties interested in acquiring the property. This time the gavel couldn't restore order. People were shouting, reporters rushing for the doors, the victims' families demanding answers. Annie sat frozen, unable to process what she was hearing. Judge Carmichael finally got control. This court is in recess until tomorrow morning. Mr. Whitmore, you will verify this information immediately. If it's credible, we'll address it then. Until that time, Miss Dalton remains in custody. Annie was led back to her cell in a daze. Robert Finch. She'd never heard the name. Didn't know who he was or why he'd confess. Couldn't understand how this was happening after weeks of everything going wrong. Officer Brennan came by her cell an hour later with dinner and information. The telegram came from Columbus Police, he said quietly. Finch walked in this morning and confessed. Said he couldn't live with the guilt anymore. 3 dead children was more than he'd bargained for. Who hired him? Annie asked. Wouldn't say at first, Brennan said. But they're working on him. Word is he's scared. Thinks whoever hired him might come after him for talking. Annie's head spun. This doesn't make sense. Why confess now? Guilt does strange things to people, Brennan said. Or maybe someone put pressure on him. Either way, Miss Dalton, this is good for you, real good. Annie wanted to believe him, but she'd learned not to trust hope until it was solid and real and couldn't be taken away. That night, she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the courtroom, heard Whitmore's voice announcing the confession. It felt like a dream, like something too perfect to be real. But when morning came and guards escorted her back to court, the tension in the air confirmed it wasn't a dream. Something had shifted. The reporters looked energized. The spectators whispered urgently. Even Morris seemed almost optimistic when Annie sat beside him. They verified the confession, Morris whispered. Finch gave details only the real arsonist would know. Whitmore scrambling. Judge Carmichael entered, and everyone stood. He looked like a man who'd slept as poorly as Annie had. Mr. Whitmore, Carmichael said without preamble. Report. Whitmore stood, and for the first time he looked defeated. Your Honor, the Columbus police have confirmed that Robert Finch's confession appears credible. He provided specific details about the fire's ignition that matched the evidence. He claims he was hired to burn the school, but was told it would be empty. When he learned children had died, Whitmore stopped, clearing his throat. He states he's been consumed by guilt ever since. And who hired him? Carmichael asked. He's identified 3 men, Whitmore said. Business owners from this area who wanted the school property for commercial development. Warner Development Company specifically. Police are moving to arrest them now. The courtroom erupted again. Annie recognized that name. Warner Development had been on Dr. Harrison's list. They'd purchased the burned property for almost nothing 2 months after the fire. Morris shot to his feet. Your Honor, in light of this confession, we move for immediate dismissal of all charges against Miss Dalton. Objection, Whitmore said, but his heart wasn't in it. The confession doesn't necessarily exonerate the defendant. It's possible both parties were involved. That's absurd, Morris interrupted. The confession clearly identifies the actual perpetrators. My client was wrongly accused, wrongly arrested, and wrongly tried. This entire prosecution has been a miscarriage of justice. Judge Carmichael held up a hand for silence. He looked at Annie for a long moment, and she couldn't read his expression. Miss Dalton, Carmichael said, stand. Annie stood on shaking legs. This was it. The moment that would determine whether she walked free or spent the next 20 years in prison despite a confession that should have cleared her. You were accused of a terrible crime, Carmichael said. The evidence against you was circumstantial but compelling. You fled jurisdiction, which did not help your case. He paused. However, in light of Mr. Finch's confession and the corroborating evidence being gathered against the actual perpetrators, this court has no choice but to acknowledge a fundamental error in the charges brought against you. Annie's vision blurred. She gripped the table to stay upright. All charges against Annie Dalton are hereby dismissed, Carmichael said. Miss Dalton, you are free to go. The gavel came down. Annie's legs gave out. Morris caught her, laughing with relief, but Annie couldn't laugh, couldn't cry, Couldn't do anything except stand there while the courtroom dissolved into chaos around her. Free. She was free. The next hours passed in a blur. Paperwork to sign, property to reclaim. Officer Brennan unlocking her cell one final time and walking her to the front door of the jail like she was fragile and might break. "Good luck, Miss Dalton," Brennan said at the entrance. "You've got a second chance. Don't waste it." Annie stepped out into afternoon sunshine that felt too bright after weeks in a cell. She stood on the steps, blinking, trying to remember what freedom felt like. A voice called her name. Annie turned and saw Clayton running toward her, coat flying behind him, hat lost somewhere, looking like he'd ridden hard and fast without stopping. He crashed into her, arms wrapping around her so tightly she couldn't breathe, and Annie didn't care. She held on to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had turned liquid and strange. "You're here," Annie managed. "How are you here?" "Telegraph," Clayton said into her hair. "Soon as I heard about the confession, I rode straight through. Didn't stop, didn't sleep, had to—" His voice broke. "Had to see you, had to make sure you were really free." Annie pulled back enough to see his face. He looked terrible, exhausted, unshaven, wild around the eyes. He looked perfect. "I'm free," Annie said, and saying it out loud made it real. "Clayton, I'm actually free." "I know," Clayton said. He was crying, which Annie had never seen before. "I know. It's over. You're safe." They stood on the jailhouse steps holding each other while people moved around them, and Annie felt something inside her chest unlock. Fear she'd been carrying for months, maybe years. The certainty that she was doomed, that justice didn't exist for people like her, that happiness was something other people got. All of it cracked and fell away, leaving her lighter than she'd been since before the fire. "Dr. Harrison found Finch," Clayton said, pulling back but keeping his hands on her shoulders like he was afraid she'd disappear. He'd been tracking the Warner development people, found evidence they'd hired someone, put pressure on through some contacts he had in Columbus, made Finch understand that confessing was better than being hunted by men who'd already killed children to protect their interests. "He's a good man," Annie said. "He's a damn saint," Clayton corrected. "So's Tom. And Morris, once we fired him and got you someone competent, and everyone back home who wouldn't stop believing in you even when things looked impossible." "Morris got fired?" "3 days ago, when he told me to stop hoping," Clayton said. "I wired money for a real lawyer out of Kansas City, but by then Finch had confessed. Timing worked out." He paused. "It's really over, Annie. The men who did this are under arrest. You're cleared. Not just released, cleared. Your name is clean." Annie tried to absorb that. Clean. No more running, no more hiding, no more looking over her shoulder waiting for the past to catch up. "What about the families?" Annie asked. "The children who died?" Clayton's expression softened. "I spoke with Mary Thompson's mother this morning. She wanted you to know she's sorry. They all are. They believed lies because they needed someone to blame, and you were easy to blame. But they know the truth now." It should have felt like vindication. Instead, Annie just felt tired. Those children were still dead. The fire had still happened. She'd still failed to save them, even if she wasn't guilty of killing them. "Annie," Clayton said gently, reading her face, "you didn't start the fire. You didn't kill anyone. You tried to save them. That's the truth, and everyone knows it now." "I still couldn't save them," Annie whispered. "No one could have," Clayton said firmly. "That fire was set to burn fast and hot specifically so no one would survive. You being there was an accident of timing. If you hadn't been, you'd have died too. The only reason you're alive is because you left when you did." Annie hadn't thought about it that way. She'd spent so long focusing on her failure that she'd never considered the alternative, that staying might have just added her name to the list of dead. "Come home," Clayton said. "Please. Everyone's waiting. Tom's probably worn a path in the barn floor from pacing. Sarah Miller's made you a welcome back banner. The whole county wants to celebrate." "I don't feel like celebrating," Annie admitted. "Then come home and rest," Clayton said. "Sit on the porch, read books, sleep in a real bed. Let people who love you take care of you for once. Love." There was that word again. Annie looked at Clayton, this stubborn, loyal man who'd refused to give up on her even when she'd given up on herself, and felt her chest tighten with something that wasn't fear. "You really love me," Annie said. Not a question. a realization. Since the first night you read Dickens in my kitchen, Clayton confirmed. Probably before that, if I'm honest. You walked into my life and made everything make sense again. He paused. And I'm asking you properly now, in front of witnesses and everything. Annie Dalton, will you come home? Not as a housekeeper, not as someone running from the past, as someone choosing a future. With me. It was as close to a proposal as a careful man could make without actually proposing. Annie should probably wait. Should process everything that had happened, recover from trauma, take time to heal before making life-changing decisions. But she'd spent months being careful, being afraid, holding back from what she wanted because wanting felt dangerous. She was done being careful. Yes, Annie said. Take me home. Clayton kissed her right there on the jailhouse steps, in front of the marshal's office and the gathering crowd and anyone else who cared to watch. It was improper and public and exactly what Annie needed. When they broke apart, Clayton was grinning. We should get married. That's what you're thinking about right now? Annie asked, half laughing. I've been thinking about it for weeks, Clayton admitted. Couldn't ask while you were in jail. Seemed presumptuous. But you're free now, and I'm not wasting any more time. Marry me, Annie. Make the ranch our ranch, the school our school, everything we've built. Make it ours officially. Annie opened her mouth to say something sensible, something about timing and healing and taking things slow. Instead, she said, All right. Clayton blinked. All right? All right, I'll marry you, Annie clarified. Assuming we can find someone willing to perform the ceremony for a woman who just got released from jail. I'll find someone if I have to ride to 3 states, Clayton promised. Annie Dalton, you just made me the happiest man in Kansas. We're still in Ohio, Annie pointed out. Doesn't matter, Clayton said. Geography's irrelevant. You said yes. That's all that counts. They left Ohio the next morning, riding the train west with the afternoon sun warming their faces. Annie watched the landscape change. Cities giving way to towns, towns giving way to prairie, everything opening up and spreading wide. The farther they got from Millbrook, the lighter she felt. Clayton sat beside her, reading one of her books, and occasionally asking questions about vocabulary. He'd improved dramatically since she'd left. Someone had been teaching him while she was gone. Tom helped, Clayton admitted when Annie asked. Took over the lessons like you would have wanted. He's actually not bad at it, patient, gets frustrated when people don't try, but good overall. And the school? Annie asked. The building? Still standing, Clayton said. Still full every evening. Mrs. Miller's been helping coordinate, making sure everyone knows the schedule. It's become... He paused, looking for words. It's become the center of everything, Annie. The place people gather. Not just for learning, but for community. You built something that matters. We built something, Annie corrected. You started it, Clayton said. I just provided the barn. They arrived in Kansas 3 days later. The final leg of the journey was by stagecoach, the same route Annie had taken months ago when she'd been running scared and alone. Now she was returning cleared, free, and engaged to a man who looked at her like she was the answer to questions he hadn't known how to ask. The stagecoach crested the final hill, and Ridge Ranch came into view. Annie's breath caught. The house looked the same, paint still peeling, barn door still crooked, but different somehow. Welcoming. Home. And standing in front of the house were what looked like half the county, Tom and the ranch hands, Sarah Miller and her family, Dr. Harrison. Families Annie had taught, people she barely knew, all gathered with signs and banners and cheers that started the moment the stagecoach stopped. Welcome home, Miss Annie, someone shouted, and then everyone was shouting, laughing, crying, pressing forward to greet her. Annie climbed down from the coach in a daze. Sarah Miller crashed into her first, hugging her waist and refusing to let go. Then Mrs. Miller, then Tom, then a crush of people all trying to touch her, welcome her, prove she was real. All right, Clayton said, laughing. Give her space. She's been through enough without being trampled by well-wishers. The crowd backed up reluctantly. Annie stood in the center of them, overwhelmed and grateful and still not quite believing this was real. We're glad you're back, Tom said simply. The school's not the same without you. I'll start teaching again tomorrow, Annie promised. Take a few days, Dr. Harrison said, appearing through the crowd. Rest first. Recover. The school will be there when you're ready. I'm ready now, Annie said, and meant it. She'd spent weeks in a cell doing nothing. She needed purpose, needed to teach, to be useful, to prove to herself that she could still do the work she loved. That evening, after everyone had left and the ranch was quiet again, Annie and Clayton sat on the porch watching fireflies dance across the prairie. The same porch where Clayton had first asked her to stay, where he told her he loved her, where everything had started. "What are you thinking?" Clayton asked. Annie considered the question. That I almost lost all of this. That I got lucky. That none of it feels quite real yet. "It's real," Clayton assured her. "You're home. You're safe. And in a few days, you'll be my wife. Very real." Annie leaned against him, letting herself relax for the first time in weeks. "Did you really find a minister willing to marry us?" "Reverend Hoskins from Wichita," Clayton said. "He's coming Saturday. Doesn't care about your past. Says everyone deserves forgiveness and fresh starts." "I like him already," Annie said. They sat in comfortable silence, and Annie tried to imagine the future. Teaching in her school, building something permanent with Clayton, living without fear for the first time in months. It should have felt perfect. It felt complicated, because the fire was still real. The children who died were still dead. And even though Annie was cleared legally, she'd never be entirely clear in her own mind. "Clayton," Annie said quietly, "what if I can't do this? What if I try to teach and keep seeing those children? What if—" "Then we figure it out," Clayton interrupted gently. "Together. Annie, I'm not expecting you to be perfect. I'm not expecting you to forget what happened or pretend you're fine. I'm just asking you to try, to stay, to let people help you." "I'm not good at being helped," Annie admitted. "I noticed," Clayton said wryly. "You're stubborn and independent and convinced you have to carry everything alone. But you don't. Not anymore." Annie turned to look at him properly. "You really think we can make this work?" "I know we can," Clayton said, "because we already are. You've been working despite fear. I've been fighting despite impossible odds. We've been building something together even when everything was falling apart. That's not going to stop just because the crisis is over." He was right. They'd already proven they could survive the worst. The question now was whether they could build something lasting from what remained. Annie decided to try. "Saturday, then," she said. "We'll get married Saturday." Clayton smiled, pulled her closer, and together they watched the Kansas sky turn from gold to purple to black, while the prairie settled into night around them. Saturday arrived faster than Annie expected. She woke before dawn in the guest room Clayton had insisted she use until the wedding. Propriety, he'd said, even though half the county already assumed they'd been improper months ago. The house was quiet except for the sounds of men moving around downstairs, preparing. Annie dressed in the only good dress she owned, dark blue with small buttons up the back that she had to contort to fasten. Her hands shook. Not from fear exactly, from the weight of everything changing, becoming permanent, becoming real in a way that couldn't be undone. A knock at the door made her jump. "It's me," Mrs. Miller's voice came through. "Can I come in?" Annie opened the door to find Mrs. Miller holding a package wrapped in brown paper, Sarah hovering behind her mother with barely contained excitement. "We brought you something," Mrs. Miller said, coming inside. "Thought you might want it for today." Annie unwrapped the package to find a dress, cream-colored, simple but beautiful, with lace at the collar and cuffs. It was clearly handmade, stitched with care. "We all contributed," Mrs. Miller said when Annie couldn't find words. "The women from the community. Couldn't let you get married in a traveling dress. You deserve something special." "I can't accept this," Annie managed. "It's too much." "You can, and you will," Mrs. Miller said firmly. "You've given us more than we can repay. Let us give you this." Sarah was practically vibrating. "Try it on, Miss Annie. We want to see." The dress fit almost perfectly. Mrs. Miller made minor adjustments with pins she'd brought, tutting about the waist and shoulders. Sarah watched with the wide-eyed fascination of a child who'd never seen a real wedding before. "You look pretty," Sarah announced. "Mr. Ridge is going to cry." "Sarah," Mrs. Miller scolded, but she was smiling. Though she's probably right. I've never seen a man look at a woman the way Clayton Ridge looks at you. Annie studied herself in the small mirror. She looked like a bride. The realization was strange and wonderful and terrifying. Just months ago, she'd been convinced she'd never have this, never have a wedding, a husband, a future that included something other than running and hiding. "Thank you," Annie said quietly, "for everything, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Mrs. Miller hugged her, careful not to disturb the pins. "You saved my daughter's future, Miss Annie. Gave her education, hope, possibilities she wouldn't have had otherwise. This dress is the least we could do." The ceremony was set for 10 o'clock in the schoolhouse they'd built together. Annie walked there with Mrs. Miller and Sarah, taking the long path that wound past the ranch house where Clayton was presumably getting ready with Tom in the hands. The schoolhouse looked different. Someone had hung flowers, wildflowers from the prairie, simple but cheerful. The rough benches had been pushed to the sides, creating an aisle down the center. 50 people, maybe more, crowded inside and spilled out the open doors. Annie's stomach dropped. "I didn't think there'd be this many people." "Half the county wanted to come," Mrs. Miller said. "You're famous now. The teacher who was wrongly accused and cleared. People love a good redemption story." "I don't feel redeemed," Annie admitted. "I just feel lucky." "Same thing sometimes," Mrs. Miller said. Reverend Hoskins was already waiting inside, a round man with kind eyes and a voice that carried. He greeted Annie warmly, asked if she was ready, and didn't seem bothered when she said she had no idea. "Most brides don't," he said cheerfully, "but you'll figure it out as you go. That's what marriage is, figuring it out together." Tom appeared at the doorway looking uncomfortable in a suit that was clearly borrowed. "Miss Annie, Clayton's ready when you are." "I need a minute," Annie said. Tom nodded and disappeared. Annie stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, looking at the people gathered inside. Families she'd taught. Children who'd learned to read under her guidance. Ranch hands who'd discovered that books weren't just for rich people. Dr. Harrison, who'd saved her life by refusing to give up the investigation. Officer Brennan, who'd traveled from Ohio just to see her marry the man who'd fought for her. These people had shown up, not just for a wedding, but for her, Annie Dalton, who'd arrived with nothing and almost left with less. "You ready?" Clayton's voice came from behind her. Annie turned. Clayton stood there in a proper suit, hair combed, beard trimmed, looking nervous and hopeful and absolutely terrified, like he was afraid she might still run. "I'm ready," Annie said, and meant it. They walked into the schoolhouse together, which probably violated some tradition, but Annie didn't care. This wasn't a traditional wedding. It was two people who'd survived something terrible choosing to build something better. Reverend Hoskins kept the ceremony short and direct. No flowery language about eternal devotion or perfect love. Just practical words about partnership, commitment, choosing each other when choosing would have been easier to avoid. "Do you, Clayton Ridge, take Annie Dalton to be your wife? To stand with her in whatever comes, good or difficult or unexpected?" "I do," Clayton said, his voice steady. "And do you, Annie Dalton, take Clayton Ridge to be your husband? To build a life with him, to let him stand with you instead of always standing alone?" Annie hesitated, not because she was uncertain, because the weight of what she was promising, to stop running, to stay, to let someone else carry part of the burden, felt enormous. But Clayton was looking at her like she was worth waiting for, worth believing in, worth fighting for. And Annie was tired of fighting alone. "I do," Annie said. Reverend Hoskins pronounced them married. Clayton kissed her carefully, like she might break, and the schoolhouse erupted in cheers that probably carried all the way to town. The celebration afterward was chaotic and loud, and exactly what Annie needed. Someone had brought food, more food than 50 people could possibly eat. Someone else had brought a fiddle and started playing, turning the schoolhouse into an impromptu dance hall. Children ran wild, adults laughed too loud. The whole thing felt messy and imperfect and real. "You all right?" Clayton asked during a brief moment of calm. They'd escaped to the porch to breathe air that wasn't thick with bodies and noise. "Overwhelmed," Annie admitted. "Good, overwhelmed, I think." "You think?" Annie laughed, a little shaky. "I spent so long convinced I'd never have this. Now that I do, I don't quite know what to do with it." "You live it," Clayton said simply. "Same as breathing. Just keep going, one day at a time." "When did you get so wise?" "When I fell in love with a stubborn woman who made me read philosophy," Clayton said. "You're a bad influence, Mrs. Ridge." Mrs. Ridge. The name settled over Annie like a coat she was still learning to wear. Strange and new, but potentially comfortable, given time. Tom appeared in the doorway, grinning. "Sarah Miller's asking when you're going to throw the bouquet, Mrs. Ridge. That's going to take some getting used to." "Tell her I'm keeping it," Annie said. "I don't believe in throwing flowers at unmarried women like they're desperate for any man who'll have them." Tom laughed. "I'll tell her you said that. She'll probably agree. That girl's got opinions." After he left, Clayton turned to Annie with an expression that was suddenly serious. "I got you something. Wedding present. Wasn't sure if it was appropriate, but..." He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. "Here." Annie unfolded it carefully. It was a deed. Ridge Ranch, signed over to joint ownership. Clayton Ridge and Annie Ridge, equal partners in the property, the land, everything. "Clayton," Annie breathed, "this is your family's ranch, your father's legacy. You can't just..." "It's our ranch now," Clayton interrupted. "Our legacy, our future. I don't want you here as a guest or a housekeeper or even just as my wife. I want you here as an equal owner, a partner in everything." Annie's vision blurred. She'd owned nothing for so long. Had nothing. Been nothing except what other people accused her of being. Now Clayton was handing her half of everything he had, no hesitation, like it was obvious. "Why?" Annie asked. "Because you've earned it," Clayton said. "Because you've put as much into this place as I have, maybe more. Because I want you to know you're not here on sufferance or charity. This is yours. You can't lose it, can't have it taken away. It's permanent. Permanent. The word Annie had been afraid of for so long. Now it felt like a promise instead of a threat. "Thank you," Annie said, clutching the deed like it might disappear. "I don't know what else to say except thank you." "Say you'll stay," Clayton said. "Not just today, but tomorrow, and next week, and next year. Say you're done running." "I'm done running," Annie promised. They went back inside to the celebration, and Annie tried to remember how to be happy without waiting for disaster. It was harder than it should have been. Every time someone laughed too loud or the door opened unexpectedly, part of her tensed, waiting for marshals or accusations or the past to come crashing back. But it didn't come. The evening wore on, people danced and ate and told stories, and nothing terrible happened. Eventually, guests started leaving, families with children who needed beds, older folks who'd stayed past their usual hours, people with chores waiting at home. Tom and the ranch hands cleared out with knowing grins and comments about giving the newlyweds privacy. Mrs. Miller hugged Annie hard enough to hurt and whispered something about being happy that Annie didn't quite catch. Dr. Harrison shook Clayton's hand and told Annie she'd done well, marrying a stubborn man to match her stubborn nature. Finally, they were alone. The schoolhouse was a mess of empty plates and wilted flowers, but Annie didn't care. She stood in the center of the room where she'd taught so many people, where she'd married Clayton an hour ago, and tried to process everything that had changed. "Come on," Clayton said gently, taking her hand. "Let's go home." Home. The ranch house. Their house now, legally and officially. Annie followed Clayton through the darkness, guided by lantern light and muscle memory. The house looked the same as always, still needed paint, still had that crooked shutter, but different somehow. Like it had been waiting for this moment to become what it was always meant to be. Inside, Clayton lit lamps and closed curtains while Annie stood awkwardly in the kitchen, not sure what to do with herself. They were married. They'd been living in the same house for months, but somehow this felt different, weighted with expectations Annie wasn't sure she could meet. "Annie," Clayton said, coming back into the kitchen, "you're terrified. I can see it from here." "I'm not terrified," Annie lied. "You're gripping that table like it's the only thing keeping you upright," Clayton pointed out. "And you've been looking at the door every 30 seconds like you're planning an escape route." Annie forced herself to let go of the table. "Sorry, I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. How to be married, what you expect." Clayton crossed the room and took her hands, gentle and steady. "I expect you to be yourself. Same as yesterday, same as tomorrow. Marriage is just a piece of paper, Annie. It doesn't change who we are." "It changes everything," Annie said. "Only if we let it," Clayton said. "Look, I know you're scared. I know you've spent months waiting for everything to fall apart. But it's not falling apart. You're safe. You're home. You're married to someone who loves you. That's the truth, and no amount of fear changes it." Annie wanted to believe him, But belief required trust, and trust required letting go of the control she'd held so tightly since Ohio. "What if I can't do this?" Annie whispered. "What if I wake up tomorrow and the fear is still there? What if I can't stop waiting for disaster?" "Then we deal with it," Clayton said. "Together, like everything else. Annie, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm just asking you to try." Trying seemed possible. Annie could try. She'd been trying since the moment she arrived at Ridge Ranch, trying to survive, trying to teach, trying to be worthy of the chances people kept giving her. Maybe marriage was just another form of trying, choosing someone every day instead of once, building something slowly instead of all at once. "Okay," Annie said. "I'll try." Clayton smiled, relieved. "Good. Now come here." He led her upstairs to the main bedroom, his father's old room, which Clayton had been using since the man died. Except it looked different now. Someone had cleaned it thoroughly, put fresh linens on the bed, placed flowers on the dresser. Annie suspected Mrs. Miller's hand in that. "I can sleep in the guest room if you need space," Clayton offered. "No expectations, Annie. We go at whatever pace works for you." It was exactly the right thing to say. Annie felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Stay, please. I don't want to be alone tonight." They undressed awkwardly, backs turned for modesty, even though it seemed ridiculous given they were married. Annie climbed into bed in her nightgown, and Clayton joined her, keeping a careful distance at first. But Annie closed that distance, curling against him like she had the night before her arrest, when she'd been terrified, and he'd been the only solid thing to hold on to. Clayton's arms came around her, warm and steady, and Annie breathed in the familiar smell of him, soap and leather and prairie wind. "Thank you," Annie said into the darkness, "for everything, for believing in me, for fighting when I couldn't fight anymore, for standing with me even when standing with me was dangerous." "You'd have done the same for me," Clayton said. "I don't know if I would have," Annie admitted. "I'm not as brave as you think I am." "You're braver," Clayton said. "You walked into that courtroom knowing you might never walk out. You faced people who hated you. You kept teaching even when you thought you'd lose everything. That's not cowardice, Annie. That's courage." Annie had never thought of it that way. She'd just been surviving, doing what needed to be done. But maybe survival was its own kind of bravery. "I love you," Annie said. She'd said it before, but saying it now, as his wife, in their home, felt different, more real, more permanent. "I love you too," Clayton said. "Now sleep. Tomorrow's going to be chaos. Everyone's going to want to visit, bring gifts, ask invasive questions about married life. We should rest while we can." Annie closed her eyes and tried to sleep. It came easier than expected, wrapped in Clayton's arms, in a house that was legally half hers, in a life she'd stopped running from. The next week settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Annie resumed teaching, though she limited evening classes to 3 nights a week instead of 7. Clayton had been right. She needed rest, needed time to process everything that had happened. The students welcomed her back like she'd never left. Sarah Miller brought her flowers every week. Tom asked increasingly complex questions about literature that made Annie suspect he'd been reading beyond the assigned material. Even the ranch hands who'd initially been skeptical about education now showed up reliably, determined to improve. But there were hard days too. Days when Annie walked into the schoolhouse and saw Mary Thompson's face instead of Sarah Miller's. Days when the smell of lamp oil made her stomach turn, remembering accusations about fire and guilt. Days when she caught herself looking at the door, expecting marshals. Clayton noticed but didn't push. He just stayed close, kept her grounded, reminded her that the past was finished and couldn't hurt her anymore. A month after the wedding, a letter arrived from Ohio. Annie's hands shook when she recognized the return address, the Thompson family, parents of 7-year-old Mary, who died in the fire. "You don't have to read it," Clayton said, watching her stare at the envelope. "I do," Annie said. "I owe them that much." She opened it carefully, bracing for accusations or anger or grief she'd have no way to answer. Instead, she found an apology. Mrs. Thompson wrote that they'd been wrong to blame Annie, wrong to believe the lies people told, wrong to let grief turn them cruel. Robert Finch's confession had revealed the truth, that the fire was deliberate, that Annie had tried to save their daughter, that the only reason Annie survived was because she'd left to get help. The letter continued with details Annie hadn't known, How Annie had pulled 2 children from the building before the roof collapsed. How she'd screamed for help until her voice gave out. How she'd tried to go back inside until neighbors physically restrained her. Annie had no memory of any of that. The night of the fire was fragmented in her mind. Smoke and heat and children's voices, and then nothing until she'd woken up in someone's house, coughing, being told 3 children were dead, and people were asking questions about how the fire started. "Annie?" Clayton's voice pulled her back. "What does it say?" Annie handed him the letter, unable to speak. Clayton read it, his expression shifting from concern to something fiercer. "You saved children," Clayton said. "You saved 2 of them. Annie, do you understand what that means?" "It means 3 still died," Annie said. "It means you're a hero, not a villain," Clayton corrected. "It means everything people accused you of was backwards. You didn't start that fire. You fought it. You didn't run from responsibility. You ran from people who blamed you for trying to help." Annie wanted to believe that, wanted to accept the Thompson family's forgiveness and their gratitude. But forgiving herself felt impossible when she could still hear those children screaming. "I don't remember saving anyone," Annie said. "I just remember failing." Clayton set the letter down and took her hands. "Then we'll work on remembering the truth instead of the trauma, however long it takes." Dr. Harrison helped with that. He visited weekly, ostensibly to check on Annie's health, but really to talk through what had happened. He'd seen trauma before. Soldiers who couldn't shake battlefield memories, accident survivors who relived disaster in their dreams. "Your mind is protecting you," Dr. Harrison explained during one visit, "blocking out the worst parts so you can function. That's normal. But it also means you're blocking out the good parts, the children you saved, the courage you showed." "I don't feel courageous," Annie said. "Courage isn't about feeling brave," Dr. Harrison said. "It's about acting despite fear. You did that, Mrs. Ridge. You're doing it now, teaching again, building a life. That's courage." The conversations helped. Slowly, Annie started remembering fragments, the weight of a child in her arms as she carried them outside, the smoke that had made breathing impossible, the moment the roof started to collapse and neighbors had grabbed her, pulled her back, stopped her from going inside again. She'd tried. She hadn't just fled. She'd fought until fighting became impossible, and then she'd run because staying would have meant dying for nothing. It didn't erase the guilt, but it made the guilt more complicated, less absolute. Annie had failed to save everyone, but she'd succeeded in saving some. Maybe that had to be enough. 2 months after the wedding, Annie missed her monthly courses. She didn't mention it to Clayton at first, afraid it meant nothing or afraid it meant everything. But when a second month passed and morning sickness started making breakfast impossible, she couldn't hide it anymore. "I think I'm pregnant," Annie said one morning, after running outside to be sick in the bushes for the 3rd time that week. Clayton, who'd been following her with a wet cloth in concern, froze. "You think, or you know?" "I'm fairly certain," Annie said, taking the cloth and wiping her face. "Unless there's another explanation for this." Clayton sat down hard on the porch steps. "We're having a baby." "Apparently," Annie said. She waited for his reaction. They hadn't discussed children, hadn't planned for this. Annie had assumed it would happen eventually, but not this soon, not when she was still piecing herself back together. "That's..." Clayton started, then stopped. "That's terrifying and wonderful, and I don't know what to feel." "Neither do I," Annie admitted, sitting beside him. "I can barely take care of myself some days. How am I supposed to take care of a child?" "The same way you've taken care of 30 students," Clayton said, "with patience and dedication and stubbornness that refuses to quit even when things get hard." "That's different," Annie said. "Students go home at the end of the day. A baby is permanent." "So are we," Clayton pointed out. "Permanent. Together, figuring this out as we go." Annie leaned against him, letting his certainty steady her. "I'm scared." "Good," Clayton said. "Means you understand the weight of it. But Annie, you're going to be an amazing mother. You already are to half the children in this county." Annie wasn't sure about that, but she had 7 months to figure it out. Dr. Harrison confirmed the pregnancy a week later. He estimated the baby would arrive in early spring, gave Annie instructions about rest and nutrition, and told Clayton to stop hovering like she was made of glass. "She's pregnant, not dying," Dr. Harrison said. "Let her teach, let her work, Let her live. Coddling helps no one. Clayton tried, but every time Annie lifted anything heavier than a book, he appeared with offers to help. Every time she looked tired, he suggested rest. It was sweet and suffocating in equal measure. "You have to stop," Annie finally said one evening. "I love you, but if you ask me one more time if I need to sit down, I'm going to scream." "I'm just trying to help," Clayton said, defensive. "I know," Annie said, "but I need you to trust that I know my own limits. I'll ask for help when I need it. Until then, treat me like a person, not a fragile object." Clayton looked hurt but nodded. "All right, I'll try." He did try. It wasn't perfect. He still worried, still hovered more than Annie wanted, but he backed off enough that she could breathe. The pregnancy progressed normally, according to Dr. Harrison. Annie's body changed in ways that felt foreign and fascinating. Her students noticed eventually, whispering among themselves until Sarah Miller finally asked directly, "Miss Annie, are you having a baby?" The whole class went silent. Annie considered deflecting, then decided honesty was better. "Yes," Annie said, "in the spring, but that doesn't mean I'm stopping lessons. You're all still learning." The students seemed relieved. Like they'd been afraid pregnancy meant abandonment, Annie understood that fear. Most frontier children had experienced adults leaving, through death, distance, or simply giving up on hard lives. "We're not going anywhere," Annie promised. "Mr. Ridge and I are staying right here. This is home." She meant it. Somewhere between arriving terrified and leaving in chains and returning married, Ridge Ranch had become home in a way nowhere else ever had. Annie had stopped looking at the horizon, stopped planning escape routes, stopped keeping her bags mentally packed. This was permanent. This was real. This was the life she'd chosen, and it was choosing her back. Winter came early that year, bringing snow that transformed the prairie into something clean and white and new. Annie taught through it, though she limited outdoor activities and let students crowd closer to the stove. Her pregnancy was showing now, obvious enough that strangers in town offered congratulations and unsolicited advice. "First baby's always the hardest," one woman told her at the general store. "But you're young and strong. You'll do fine." Annie accepted the advice with as much grace as she could manage, privately thinking that surviving arrest and trial probably prepared her for anything childbirth could throw at her. Clayton was preparing in his own way, building a cradle from scratch, reading books about infant care, asking Dr. Harrison endless questions. He was going to be an anxious father. Annie found it endearing and occasionally exhausting. "What if I do it wrong?" Clayton asked one night, sanding the cradle for the 10th time. "What if I'm a terrible father like my own was?" "You're nothing like your father," Annie said firmly. "You teach ranch hands to read. You build schools. You married a woman everyone else had given up on. That's not the behavior of a terrible father." "But what if—" "Clayton," Annie interrupted, "we're both going to make mistakes. That's parenthood. But we're going to make them together, and we're going to figure it out. Stop looking for disaster." "You look for disaster constantly," Clayton pointed out. "And I'm working on not doing that," Annie said, "which means you should too." Clayton set down the sandpaper and crossed to where Annie sat, placing a hand on her growing belly. "We're really doing this." "Too late to back out now," Annie said. She felt the baby move under Clayton's hand, a flutter that was becoming more common, more real. Proof that this wasn't just theory or fear, but an actual person growing inside her, depending on her, trusting her completely. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. It was both things at once, and Annie was learning to hold both fear and hope simultaneously. 3 days before Christmas, another letter arrived from Ohio. This one was official, bearing the seal of the county courthouse. Annie opened it with hands that wanted to shake but didn't quite. The letter informed her that the state had officially expunged her arrest record, all charges dismissed, all documentation of the case sealed. In the eyes of the law, Annie Dalton Ridge had never been accused of anything. There was also a check, compensation for wrongful arrest and imprisonment. The amount was substantial, more money than Annie had seen in her entire life. "Clayton," Annie said faintly, "you need to see this." Clayton read the letter, then the check, then looked at Annie with an expression caught between shock and satisfaction. "They're trying to buy your silence." "We're trying to make amends," Annie said. "Does it matter which?" "Not really," Clayton admitted. "What do you want to do with it?" Annie looked at the check, at the number that represented weeks in a cell, nights of terror, a trial that had almost destroyed her. Money couldn't undo that. But money could build something better. The school, Annie said. We use it for the school. Buy proper desks, books, supplies. Maybe hire another teacher so we can expand. Turn it into something real and permanent. You're sure? Clayton asked. That money's yours, Annie. You earned it through suffering. You could use it for anything, yourself, the baby, savings. I'm sure, Annie said. Those children died because people valued profit over lives. I'm not going to profit from their deaths. I'm going to use this money to make sure other children get the education they deserve. That's the only thing that makes sense. Clayton pulled her close, careful of her belly. You're extraordinary. You know that? I'm just trying to make something good from something terrible, Annie said. That's not extraordinary. That's just survival. It's both, Clayton said, and I love you for it. They spent the compensation money carefully over the next months. New desks arrived from Kansas City, proper ones with inkwells and smooth writing surfaces. Books came by the crate, readers, arithmetic texts, geography primers, literature. Annie hired Emily Marsh, a young woman from Topeka who'd been teaching in a one-room schoolhouse and jumped at the chance for better pay and resources. By late February, the school had transformed from a converted barn into a proper educational institution. 2 teachers, 60 students ranging from 6 to 60 years old, classes 6 days a week. It was everything Annie had dreamed of, and more. We're going to need a bigger building soon, Emily observed one afternoon, watching students crowd onto benches meant for half their number. I know, Annie said. Her due date was 2 weeks away, and she was enormous, uncomfortable, and still teaching because stopping felt like giving up. Clayton's already talking about expansion, building a proper schoolhouse with real classrooms. You two are going to change this whole county, Emily said. We're trying, Annie said. 1 student at a time. The baby arrived on March 15th during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and made the whole house feel like it was shaking. Annie's labor was long and difficult, nothing like the smooth deliveries people sometimes described. She screamed, she swore, she told Clayton she was never doing this again. Dr. Harrison stayed calm through all of it, coaching her through contractions, assuring Clayton that everything was normal, that first births were often hard. Finally, after 14 hours that felt like 14 years, Annie heard a cry that wasn't hers. Dr. Harrison placed a tiny, squalling, perfect baby girl in her arms, and Annie forgot immediately how much everything had hurt. She's beautiful, Clayton said, tears streaming down his face. Annie, she's perfect. The baby wasn't perfect. She was red and wrinkled and angry at being born, but she was theirs, alive and healthy and real. What should we name her? Annie asked. They discussed names but never settled on one. Now, holding their daughter while thunder rolled outside, Annie knew exactly what to call her. Hope, Annie said. Her name is Hope. Clayton understood immediately. Hope for the future they were building. Hope that replaced the fear Annie had carried for so long. Hope that things could be better, could be good, could be everything they'd fought for. Hope Ridge, Clayton said, testing it. I like it. Hope was a terrible sleeper and a champion eater, keeping Annie and Clayton up most nights that first month. Annie taught from home during those weeks, too exhausted for full school days. Emily handled most of the classes while Annie recovered and learned how to be a mother. It was harder than teaching. Babies didn't follow lesson plans or respond to reason. Hope cried when she was hungry, when she was tired, when she was uncomfortable, when she was perfectly fine but felt like crying anyway. Annie spent those first weeks in a fog of exhaustion and overwhelming love, wondering how anyone survived parenthood. You're doing great, Clayton assured her during a particularly rough night when Hope wouldn't stop crying and Annie was crying too. I have no idea what I'm doing, Annie said. Neither do I, Clayton admitted. But she's alive and fed and loved. That's probably enough. It was enough. Somehow, despite all the uncertainty and fear and exhaustion, it was enough. By April, Annie felt strong enough to return to the schoolhouse. She brought Hope with her, letting students take turns holding the baby while Annie taught. Hope became the school mascot, passed from lap to lap, loved by everyone. She's going to grow up thinking she has 30 parents, Emily observed, watching Tom carefully hold the baby like she might break. Worse things to believe, Annie said. Spring turned to summer, and life settled into a new rhythm. Teaching during the day, caring for Hope in the evenings, working with Clayton to expand the school and the ranch. It wasn't easy. Some days were still hard, still touched by fear or memory or simple exhaustion. But more days were good. Days when Annie taught and saw understanding dawn on a student's face. Days when Hope laughed for the first time, a sound that made everything else worthwhile. Days when Annie looked around at the life she'd built and couldn't quite believe she got to keep it. She'd arrived at Ridge Ranch with nothing but fear and books. Now she had a home, a husband, a daughter, a school, a community. She had a future that looked nothing like the past she'd run from. And for the first time since the fire, Annie looked forward to tomorrow instead of dreading it. 1 year later, Annie stood at the front of a classroom that barely resembled the converted barn they'd started with. The new schoolhouse had been completed in late fall. 2 proper rooms with real windows, a small library corner, and a bell tower that rang every morning to call students from miles around. The old barn still stood beside it, now used for storage and overflow seating when enrollment swelled beyond capacity, which happened often. Word had spread across 3 counties about the Ridge School, as people were calling it. Families traveled hours for the chance to give their children an education. Adults who'd spent entire lives unable to read showed up with worn hands and hopeful faces, asking if it was too late to learn. Annie always said no, it was never too late. Miss Annie? Sarah Miller, now 11 and reading at a level that would shame most city children, raised her hand. Can we talk about the Transcendentalist today? I finished the Emerson essay you assigned. You were supposed to read the first 3 pages, Annie said. I read the whole thing, Sarah said, unapologetic. Twice. I have questions. Around her, other students groaned good-naturedly. Sarah's hunger for knowledge had only intensified over the past year, pushing Annie to reach deeper into literature and philosophy than she'd planned for a frontier schoolhouse. Save the questions for advanced class tonight, Annie said. Right now we're working on arithmetic. The younger students looked relieved. Tom, sitting in the back row during his lunch break from ranch work, grinned. He'd become Sarah's unofficial study partner, the 2 of them debating literature and ideas with an intensity that sometimes made Annie nostalgic for the simplicity of teaching basic alphabet. After the morning session ended, Annie walked back to the ranch house to feed Hope, who was nearing 15 months now and into everything. Clayton had her in the kitchen, attempting to keep her from climbing onto the table while simultaneously trying to prepare lunch. Your daughter is part mountain goat, Clayton announced when Annie entered. I turned my back for 10 seconds and she was standing on a chair reaching for the sugar jar. She's your daughter when she misbehaves, Annie said, scooping Hope into her arms. The girl immediately grabbed Annie's hair and pulled with the casual cruelty of toddlers everywhere. Mama, Hope said clearly. It was one of her few words, along with no and mine and papa, which she used exclusively when she wanted Clayton to give her things Annie had said she couldn't have. Traitor, Annie told her daughter, who laughed like it was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. They ate lunch together. The 3 of them crowded around the kitchen table that had once hosted awkward dinners with silent ranch hands. Now it felt like the center of something, the place where their family gathered and talked and made plans. The county board wants to meet with you, Clayton said between bites. They're talking about creating an official school district, want you to run it. Annie nearly choked on her bread. What? I can't run a whole district. I'm barely managing 1 school. You're managing it perfectly, Clayton corrected. Emily's handling half the teaching load now, and you've already trained 3 other women to start satellite schools in their communities. Whether you call it a district or not, you're already running one. That's different from being official, Annie said. Official means politics and bureaucracy, and answering to people who'll have opinions about what we teach and how we teach it. You've been answering to the community since you started, Clayton pointed out. At least this way you'd have a salary and some authority to expand properly. Build more schools, hire more teachers, reach families that are too far out to send their children here. It was tempting. Annie had been thinking about expansion for months, trying to figure out how to reach the scattered homesteads where children grew up without ever seeing a book. But official recognition meant visibility, and visibility still made her nervous despite being legally cleared. I need to think about it, Annie said. Fair enough, Clayton said. But, Annie, You've spent a year and a half proving you're not running anymore. Maybe it's time to stop acting like you are. The words stung because they were true. Annie still caught herself planning escape routes, still tensed when strangers arrived, still sometimes woke in the middle of the night convinced marshals were at the door. The fear had faded, but not disappeared, lodged somewhere deep where logic couldn't quite reach it. "I'm trying," Annie said quietly. "I know," Clayton said, gentler now. "And you're doing better than you think. But you can't let what happened in Ohio control what happens here. Those men are in prison. You're free. It's time to act like it." That afternoon, Annie taught advanced literature to a mixed group of teenagers and adults who'd progressed beyond basic reading. They were discussing Hawthorne, debating symbolism in ways that would have impressed university students. Tom argued passionately about moral complexity, while Sarah countered with points about social responsibility. Emily moderated, occasionally looking at Annie with an expression that said, "Can you believe we're doing this in rural Kansas?" Annie could believe it. She'd seen what happened when you gave people access to knowledge they'd been denied. They didn't just learn, they transformed. Tom had gone from a ranch hand who could barely write his name to someone who read poetry for pleasure and debated philosophy. Sarah had gone from a girl with no prospects beyond farm wife to someone who talked about attending college back east. These changes mattered, not just to the individuals, but to the entire community. Literacy rates had jumped. Local farmers were keeping better records, negotiating better prices. Women were writing letters to newspapers, organizing civic improvements, demanding voices in decisions that affected them. Education was power. Annie had always known that intellectually. Now she was watching it happen in real time. After class, Dr. Harrison stopped by with news. He'd been spending more time at the ranch lately, partly to check on Hope's development, and partly because he'd become something like family. "The Warner development men went to trial," Dr. Harrison said without preamble. "All 3 convicted. 20 years minimum." Annie had been expecting this. The trial had been ongoing for months, but hearing it confirmed still felt strange. Those men had destroyed her life, killed 3 children, all for profit they'd never even gotten to enjoy. Now they'd spend decades in prison, and Annie was supposed to feel something about that. She wasn't sure what she felt. Relief, maybe. Vindication. But mostly just tired of thinking about it. "Good," Annie said simply. "They deserved worse." "They did," Dr. Harrison agreed, "but at least there's justice. And Annie, there's something else. The families from Ohio, the ones who lost children, they've established a scholarship fund, in your name, for frontier children who want to pursue education beyond basic schooling." Annie's throat tightened. "They did what?" "Called it the Annie Dalton Ridge Memorial Scholarship Fund," Dr. Harrison said. "Poor naming, since you're not dead, but the intention's good. They wanted to honor the children who died by helping other children learn. Thought you'd be the right person to represent that." "I don't want my name on it," Annie said immediately. "Use the children's names. Mary, James, Emma. They deserve to be remembered." "I suggested that," Dr. Harrison said. "They insisted on yours. Said you tried to save their children, and now you're saving others through teaching. They want your name attached to something good instead of just tragedy." Annie had to sit down. The Thompson family, whose daughter had died while Annie failed to save her, wanted to honor Annie's work. It was forgiveness she hadn't asked for and didn't quite know how to accept. "Tell them thank you," Annie managed, "and that I'll make sure the money goes to students who'll use it well." After Dr. Harrison left, Annie sat on the porch with Hope playing at her feet, watching the sun set over the prairie. Clayton joined her, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. "You all right?" Clayton asked. "I don't know," Annie admitted. "A year ago I was in a cell waiting to be convicted of killing those children. Now their families are creating scholarships in my name. It feels wrong somehow, like I'm profiting from their deaths." "You're honoring their deaths," Clayton corrected. "There's a difference. Those children died in a fire set by greedy men. Nothing changes that. But you're making sure other children get opportunities they never had. That's not profit. That's purpose." Purpose. Annie turned the word over in her mind. She'd spent so long just surviving that she'd almost forgotten about purpose, about building something that mattered beyond her own life. "The county wants me to run their school district," Annie said. "I heard," Clayton said. "What are you going to tell them?" "I don't know yet," Annie said. "Part of me wants to say yes, build something bigger, reach more people. But part of me is still scared of being that visible. What are you scared of? Clayton asked. Specifically, not vague fears, actual specific consequences. Annie thought about it. That I'll fail, that I'll make promises I can't keep, that I'll let people down the way I let those children down. You didn't let those children down, Clayton said firmly. You tried to save them. You pulled 2 of them out before the building collapsed. You did everything you could. It wasn't enough, Annie whispered. It never is, Clayton said. That's the thing about tragedy, Annie. It's not about enough or not enough. It just is. Those children died. You survived. And you get to choose what you do with that survival. You can spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for not being able to do the impossible, or you can honor them by doing what you do best, teaching other children, giving them futures, making sure their deaths meant something. Annie had heard versions of this argument before, from Clayton and Dr. Harrison, and even from her own mind during clearer moments. But hearing it now, sitting on the porch of a home she'd helped build, watching her daughter play, thinking about the students who depended on her, it finally settled into truth instead of just words. She couldn't save those children, but she could save others in a different way, could give them knowledge and opportunity and the tools to build better lives than they'd been born into. I'll talk to the county board, Annie said. See what they're actually proposing. But Clayton, if I do this, it's going to mean more work, more responsibility. I can't do it alone. You're not alone, Clayton said. You've got me. You've got Emily. You've got Tom and every student you've ever taught. Annie, you've built an entire community around education. They'll support you. And if I fail, then we'll figure it out, Clayton said. Same as everything else. But I don't think you will. You're too stubborn to fail at something you care about this much. The county board meeting happened 2 weeks later in the new schoolhouse. Annie dressed carefully, not fancy, but professional, trying to look like someone who could run a school district despite having been arrested for murder 18 months ago. The thought would have been funny if it wasn't so surreal. The board consisted of 5 men, most of them ranchers or business owners, who'd never shown much interest in education until it started producing results. Mr. Pritchard, who owned the general store, served as chairman. He'd been skeptical of Annie when she first arrived. Now his 3 children attended her school and could read better than he could. Mrs. Ridge, Pritchard began formally. Thank you for meeting with us. We'll get straight to the point. The county needs an organized education system. Right now we've got your school here and a few scattered one-room buildings teaching basic lessons. We want something more structured. A real district with standards, certified teachers, regular funding. And you want me to organize it? Annie said. We want you to run it, Pritchard corrected. You'd be the county superintendent. Hire teachers, set curriculum, manage funding, expand where needed. We're prepared to offer a salary of $1,200 annually, plus budget for school construction and teacher wages. It was more money than Annie had ever made teaching, more than she'd made from anything. But money wasn't the question. What control would I have? Annie asked. Over what we teach, how we teach it, who we hire? The board members exchanged looks. Within reason, Pritchard said carefully. Obviously, we'd need to approve major decisions, curriculum choices, building projects, significant expenditures. No, Annie said flatly. Pritchard blinked. No? If you want me to run this district, I need actual authority, Annie said. I'll consult with the board on budget and building projects. But curriculum and hiring decisions are mine. I won't have politicians dictating what books students can read or which teachers are acceptable based on factors that have nothing to do with their ability to teach. That's asking for a lot of trust, one of the other board members said. You approached me, Annie pointed out. If you don't trust my judgment, hire someone else. But if you want results like what we've achieved here, you need to let me work the way I work. I don't teach by committee. The room went silent. Annie waited, heart pounding, prepared to walk away if they couldn't accept her terms. She'd built something good at Ridge School without board approval. She could keep building it, smaller maybe, but still hers. Finally, Pritchard smiled. You drive a hard bargain, Mrs. Ridge, but I suppose that's why we want you. All right, curriculum and hiring are yours. We'll handle funding and facility approval, but we'll need quarterly reports and the right to review if things go wrong. Fair enough, Annie said. They spent the next hour hammering out details. Annie would officially start January 1st, giving her 3 months to prepare. She'd keep teaching at Ridge School while building the district infrastructure. Emily would take over more daily operations at the main school, and they'd begin recruiting teachers for satellite locations. It was terrifying and exciting, and everything Annie had been too scared to hope for a year ago. When she got home, Clayton was waiting on the porch with Hope. The girl immediately ran to Annie, shouting, "Mama!" and demanding to be picked up despite getting heavier every day. "Well?" Clayton asked. "I'm the county superintendent of schools," Annie said, still not quite believing it. "Starting January." Clayton whooped, grabbed her and Hope both, and spun them around until Hope shrieked with laughter, and Annie begged him to stop before she got dizzy. "I'm proud of you," Clayton said, setting them down but keeping one arm around Annie. "You're going to change everything." "I'm going to try," Annie said. "That's all I can promise." "Trying's enough," Clayton said. "It always has been." The next months were chaos. Annie worked 12-hour days, teaching in the mornings and organizing the district in the afternoons. She interviewed potential teachers, visited sites for new school buildings, drafted curriculum standards that balanced practical skills with broader education. Emily proved invaluable, managing Ridge School's daily operations and handling the overflow of administrative tasks Annie couldn't get to. Tom started training to become a teacher himself, working with younger students under Emily's supervision. Sarah Miller, now 12, began helping with the primary classes, showing a natural talent for patient explanation. The district started to take shape. By Christmas, they'd hired 4 new teachers and identified 6 locations for school buildings. 3 would open in the spring, the others by fall. Funding came from a combination of county taxes, private donations, and the scholarship fund that Annie still felt uncomfortable accepting but couldn't deny was useful. Hope turned 2 on a snowy January morning, celebrated with cake that she smeared enthusiastically across her face, while adults pretended not to notice. She was talking more now, stringing together simple sentences, asking endless questions about everything she saw. Clayton joked that she'd inherited Annie's curiosity and his stubbornness, a combination that promised trouble later. Annie didn't mind. Trouble meant Hope was engaged, thinking, learning. It meant she'd grow up with opportunities Annie had fought for. Education Clayton had been denied, a future neither of them had imagined possible for frontier children. That evening, after Hope was asleep and the house was quiet, Annie and Clayton sat together in the study, a room they'd added during the fall expansion, lined with books Annie had collected over the past year. It was Annie's favorite room, the place she retreated to when the weight of responsibility felt too heavy. "Read to me?" Clayton asked, settling into the chair by the lamp. It had become their ritual. Most nights, after Hope was down and work was finished, Annie would read aloud while Clayton listened. They'd worked through Dickens, Austen, Melville, and were currently tackling Whitman's poetry, which Clayton claimed not to understand but clearly loved. Annie opened Leaves of Grass to a marked page and began reading. Her voice filled the quiet room, shaping words about America and democracy and the dignity of common people. Clayton listened with the same focused attention he'd shown that first night in the kitchen, back when Annie was just a housekeeper and he was just a lonely rancher, and neither of them knew they were building toward this. When Annie finished the poem, Clayton was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't gotten on that stagecoach? If you'd stayed somewhere else, hidden somewhere else?" "Sometimes," Annie admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it." "I think about it," Clayton said. "I think about how close I came to never meeting you, how different my life would be. Probably still alone in a half-dead ranch, pretending I was fine. Definitely not running a successful cattle operation or co-managing a school district or raising a daughter who already reads better than I did at 20. "You'd have figured it out," Annie said. "Maybe," Clayton said, "but it wouldn't have been this specific life, this specific happiness. That only exists because you ran scared to Kansas, and I was desperate enough to hire you without checking references." Annie crossed to him, perching on the arm of his chair. "You think it was just luck? Random chance that I ended up here?" "I think," Clayton said carefully, "that terrible things happened to you. Truly terrible, unfair, cruel things. And you could have let those things destroy you. Could have stayed bitter and afraid and convinced the world was only pain. But instead you kept trying, kept teaching, kept caring, kept building something good out of something awful. That's not luck, Annie. That's who you are." Annie felt tears threaten but didn't try to stop them. She'd spent so long believing she was just a victim, Just someone things happened to, that she'd forgotten she'd made choices too. The choice to teach in a converted barn, the choice to stay when staying was dangerous, the choice to face trial instead of running again, the choice to accept love instead of pushing it away. All those choices had led here, to this room, this moment, this life that felt almost too good to be real but was real anyway. "I'm glad I got on that stagecoach," Annie said, even knowing everything that would happen, the arrest, the trial, all of it, because it led here, to you, to hope, to work that matters. "To a life worth living," Clayton added. "Yes," Annie agreed, "to a life worth living." Spring arrived with storms that rattled the new school buildings and tested their construction. The buildings held. 3 satellite schools opened on schedule, staffed by teachers Annie had personally trained. Enrollment across the district hit 200 students, with more expected by fall. The county board approved funding for 2 additional schools and salary increases for existing teachers. Annie fought for better materials, won most of her battles, and learned to compromise on the ones that mattered less. She was becoming, despite herself, a competent administrator. But administration was never the point. The point was students. Annie made time to visit each school monthly, teaching sample lessons and observing the new teachers. She saw 6-year-olds learning to write their names. She saw adults in their 40s reading newspapers for the first time. She saw teenage girls discussing science and boys debating history, and entire communities transforming because someone had finally given them access to knowledge. One afternoon in April, Annie visited the westernmost school, a small building serving 3 families on the far edge of the county. The teacher was Ruth Brennan, Officer Brennan's niece, who'd moved west specifically to teach after her uncle told her about the district. Annie arrived during a lesson and stood quietly in the back, watching Ruth work. The woman had 10 students ranging from 7 to 15, all at different levels, and she managed them with patience and creativity that reminded Annie of herself. After class, Ruth approached nervously. "How did I do? I know the multi-grade classroom is challenging, but I think I'm managing. You're doing beautifully," Annie interrupted. "Your pacing is excellent, your explanations are clear, and you made every student feel seen. That's not easy with mixed ages." Ruth's relief was visible. "Thank you. I was worried I wasn't meeting district standards." "The district standards are simple," Annie said. "Teach every student like they matter because they do. Challenge them without breaking them. Make them believe education can change their lives. You're doing all 3. That's what counts." On the ride back to Ridge Ranch, Annie thought about how many lives were being changed. Not just students, but teachers too. Women like Ruth, who'd never imagined having professional careers, now had purpose and income and respect. Men like Tom, who'd been dismissed as uneducated, were discovering abilities they didn't know they possessed. Education didn't just change individuals, it changed entire communities. And Annie was at the center of that change, driving it, shaping it, proving that frontier children deserved the same opportunities as city children. It was the work she'd always been meant to do. She just hadn't known it would take arrest and trial, and nearly losing everything to fully understand that. Summer brought a letter from Ohio that Annie almost didn't open. She'd stopped fearing mail from back east, but old instincts died hard. Clayton found her staring at the envelope like it might bite. "Want me to read it first?" he offered. "No," Annie said. "I need to do this." The letter was from Margaret Thompson, Mary's mother. She wrote about the scholarship fund's success. They'd already helped 5 students attend schools beyond their family's means. She wrote about the trial's aftermath, about how the community had begun healing now that the real criminals were punished. And then she wrote something that made Annie's hands shake. "We buried Mary with one of the books you gave her. The poetry collection you said was too advanced, but she insisted on trying anyway. She loved that book, Mrs. Ridge. She loved you. And I need you to know that we don't blame you for what happened. We never should have." Mary would have been heartbroken to know people blamed her favorite teacher for trying to save her life. "Please forgive us for the pain we caused you. We were grieving and angry, and we hurt an innocent person. That's not justice. And we're sorry." Annie read the letter 3 times, then handed it to Clayton without speaking. He read it silently, then pulled Annie close. "They forgive you," Clayton said. "I didn't need their forgiveness," Annie said, surprising herself. "I mean, it's kind, and I appreciate it, but I didn't do anything wrong. I tried to save their daughter. I failed, but trying wasn't a crime." It was the first time Annie had said that without qualification or guilt. She'd tried. She'd failed. Both things were true, and neither was shameful. Failure wasn't the same as fault. "You're right," Clayton said. "You don't need forgiveness, but maybe they needed to give it anyway, for themselves." Annie thought about that, about how forgiveness worked, how it freed both the forgiver and the forgiven, how holding on to blame and guilt helped no one. "I forgive them too," Annie said, "for believing I killed their daughter, for the trial, the accusations, all of it. They were in pain. People in pain make mistakes." "We all make mistakes," Clayton agreed. That night, Annie wrote back to Margaret Thompson. She thanked her for the letter, for the scholarship fund, for the grace of forgiveness neither of them had known they needed. She wrote about the school district, about hope, about the life she'd built from the ashes of the one that burned. She wrote about learning to carry grief and joy simultaneously, about how one didn't erase the other, but somehow both could exist together. About how Mary and James and Emma's deaths would always be tragic, but didn't have to be meaningless if they inspired others to value education, to protect children, to build communities where knowledge mattered. It was the longest letter Annie had written in years. When she finished, she felt lighter somehow, like she'd been carrying weight she hadn't noticed until setting it down. Fall arrived with the opening of 3 more schools, bringing the district total to 9 buildings and 6 teachers. Enrollment hit 350 students. The county board approved Annie's budget proposal for the following year with minimal argument, clearly pleased with results. Hope turned 3 and started attending the primary class at Ridge School, much to Sarah Miller's delight. Sarah had become Hope's unofficial tutor, reading to her and teaching her letters, and generally treating the girl like a beloved younger sister. "Your daughter is terrifyingly smart," Emily observed one afternoon, watching Hope correctly identify all her letters at 3 years old. "She's going to be running this school by age 10. "Let's hope not," Annie said. "I'd like to keep my job a few more years." But watching Hope learn with the same hunger Annie had once felt, the same drive for knowledge and understanding, filled Annie with fierce pride. Her daughter would never be denied education, would never feel limited by gender or geography or circumstance, would grow up knowing she could be anything, do anything, learn anything. That was what all this work meant, not just for Hope, but for every child in the district. Annie was building a future where frontier children didn't have to choose between education and survival, where they could have both. On a clear October morning, Annie stood in front of the new district office, a small building adjacent to Ridge School, and watched workers install the final touch. A brass bell, donated by the Thompson family, cast with an inscription, "In memory of Mary, James, and Emma. May knowledge ring eternal." The bell would call students to class, mark the hours, signal emergencies. But more than that, it would remind everyone what they were building. A community that valued education, a place where children's lives mattered, a future different from the past. Clayton appeared beside her, Hope riding on his shoulders. Their daughter pointed at the bell and demanded to know what it was for. "It's for learning," Annie said. "When it rings, it means it's time to learn." "I like learning," Hope announced with the certainty of a 3-year-old who'd never been told she couldn't. "Good," Annie said. "Never stop." That evening, after the official dedication ceremony and speeches Annie had been forced to give, after the county board congratulated themselves and the community celebrated, after everyone went home, Annie and Clayton sat on the schoolhouse steps with Hope between them. "You did it," Clayton said. "Built something that's going to outlast us. That's going to change this county for generations." "We did it," Annie corrected. "You, me, Emily, Tom, every teacher and student and family that believed education mattered. This isn't mine, it's ours." "Fair enough," Clayton said, "but you started it. That counts for something." Annie looked at the bell tower, silhouetted against the darkening sky. She thought about the journey that led here, the fire that destroyed her first life, the terror of running, the arrest that nearly ended everything, the trial that could have sent her to prison, the choices that had seemed impossible but turned out to be exactly right. She thought about the children she couldn't save and the hundreds she was saving now, in different ways, about how tragedy and redemption weren't opposites but somehow existed together, woven into the same story. "I used to think the fire destroyed my life," Annie said quietly, "that it took everything and left me with nothing. But maybe it didn't destroy my life. Maybe it just ended one version and forced me to build something different, something better, in some ways. You think so? Clayton asked. I don't know, Annie admitted. I'd still choose to have those children alive. I'd still choose a world where that fire never happened. But since I can't change the past, since it happened regardless of what I wanted, then yes. I'm glad I built this life instead of just surviving. I'm glad I found you. I'm glad we're raising hope here, teaching these students, building this future. Me too, Clayton said simply. Hope had fallen asleep against Annie's shoulder, worn out from the day's excitement. Annie held her daughter close, feeling the steady breathing that meant safety, security, a childhood nothing like Annie's own. This was what mattered. Not the past, not the accusations, not even the redemption or the vindication or the justice that had eventually arrived. What mattered was this moment, this family, this work, this community they'd built from nothing. The brass bell caught the last light of sunset, gleaming like a promise. Tomorrow it would ring for the first time, calling students to learn. The day after that, it would ring again. And the day after that, and the day after that, marking time and progress and the steady accumulation of knowledge that changed lives. Annie had arrived in Kansas with nothing but books and fear. Now she had a husband, a daughter, a career, a community. She had a future that looked nothing like the past she'd run from. She had proof that even after betrayal and loss and injustice, courage and determination could still build something extraordinary. The bell would ring, students would learn, and life would continue forward instead of backward. That was all anyone could ask for. That was everything. Annie kissed Hope's sleeping head, reached for Clayton's hand, and watched the stars begin to appear over the prairie. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did. But tomorrow would also bring new students, new opportunities, new chances to prove that education mattered and children deserved better and the future was worth fighting for. She was ready for tomorrow, for next year, for whatever came after. Because she'd learned the hardest truth of all, that you didn't need a perfect past to build a good future. You just needed to keep trying, keep teaching, keep believing that better was possible. The bell hung silent in its tower, waiting for morning. And Annie waited with it, no longer running from anything, finally ready to stay.